Okay, let's come back. So now we have a special presentation um, that is programmed for our break, our lunch break. So for those of you who can't get enough of presentations, you've been listening for 3 hours. If you want to listen for another hour before you get to the afternoon sessions, we have a special presentation for you right now. Okay, so let's move to that break presentation here. Let me get it up on the screen. Okay, so the presentation is titled Utuado Update, and it's presented by Yasmin Sanchez Reyes, colleagues, and students. Yasmin?
Hello, Professor, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, yes.
Oh, good, good. Thank you so much to everyone. Don't worry, we're not going to take up too much of your time. We know that everyone has so many things to do, but we're so happy to be here with you all. And I wish I could see all of the presentations. We have some family members in recovery, so there's a lot of things to do here in the house, but we're so happy that we're able to join you. I believe that there's some students from Utuado who have also joined us. We have so many problems with connection in Utuado with the weather, so I'm happy. I think that everybody's been able to connect. And I appreciate all of you, and I'm so happy that everybody's continuing to work on so many amazing and beautiful topics. I have been in the program since about 2014, I believe, and just doing it slowly, chugging away through thick and thin, and with the help and support of our wonderful professors and staff and our students and each other. Marien, I don't know if you're still here, but so wonderful to see all of you and Marcos and everybody. Hello, hello. It's so good to hear that everybody's still up to so many wonderful, beautiful, and amazing projects, and I wish you all the best with everything. Yes, so thank you so much. We wanted to give an update about Utuado because Utuado has been presenting at this symposium, this wonderful, beautiful, amazing symposium for, I don't know, about 6 years or so, if not more. And then we had a break for different reasons. And now we're back and we want to let people know how are the people of the mountain region. So if any of the students want to join me, please feel free. I'm going to go through the slides and if you can all read along, I can call you by name or you can just jump up, but feel free to let me know. Okay, we can begin, Professor. So even though this update is about this next generation of young people, we want to acknowledge that our people have been in this mountain region for thousands of years. There you can see when they were lifting up the rocks of the Centro Ceremonial de Caguana, also known as like El Parque Ceremonial de Caguana, or I don't know how people say that name, but there you can see in 1915 that when they were lifting up those rocks, there was bohíos there. There were people there that have been living there for many generations. Utuado is in the heart of the mountain, and in the heart of Puerto Rico, as you can see in that picture there. It's the red area there. Very large area. I mean, it takes me 45 minutes to work to the lower that goes down to the University of Puerto Rico in Utuado, and I live in Utuado. And if I were to try to get to another part of Utuado, it could take me even two hours. So it is a beautiful place, deep in the heart of Puerto Rico. And to this day, we still have our ancestral dances and rituals and things performed, as you can see there in the picture. So I want to also just point out that this is a continuity of our people, and we are happy to still be here with you all. Even though formally Utuado was founded in 1739 under the Spanish, as you can see there, there's a beautiful flag of Utuado that represents the nature and the indigenous ancestry. Also, the variety of places in Utuado is astounding. And what makes it also so beautiful is all of the people. So Utuado, according to the students, has a cool mountainous climate, an older population with fewer younger residents, a rich natural environment with abundant vegetation, but limited commercial activity, creating a quieter atmosphere. And that's the next slide, Professor. And the next slide. Here you can see us in 2016, a beautiful graduation ceremony in our gorgeous campus, which we invite you all to come and not only to attend, but to defend this beauty that we have in this jewel that we have within the heart of Puerto Rico, which is the University of Puerto Rico, Recinto de Utuado. And there are the students who are our future. And we have some students here who will be attending a ceremony very much like this very soon. So we congratulate you all and know that our future is in good hands because of you wonderful young people. So I asked the university students in Utuado, how have you been over the last few years since the pandemic began? And what message do you have for others based on your experiences? And this is what they said. Diana, would you like to? Let me see if Diana's with us.
Oops.
Leanne, would you like to read the slide? Auralice, how about you? Would you like to read the slide? No problem. Learning from past experiences. Growing up in the countryside, one of the most saddening things after Huracán Maria was going outside and seeing the impact it had on the environment. What's remarkable is that nature was able to return to its original state before we could. Our community grew closer and came together to help fix each other's houses. When the COVID-19 outbreak happened, we could not go out unless it was necessary. Because of this, we got to see how wild animals were able to explore urban areas all around the world. We also adapted and learned more about technology and how we can use it for our own good. Our bad memories and our bad experiences are what make us who we are and what make us grow and allow us to learn if we choose to see the lessons in those experiences. Elijah Wood. Would anyone like to read the next slide?
I can go.
Awesome, thank you.
These past few years have been really hard for this new Puerto Rican generation. We have accomplished so much in such short notice. This is a vivid example of what Puerto Ricans hold as culture resilience. We have been through hurricanes, earthquakes, tornadoes, political issues, and a pandemic, and not once have we given up. Not once have we let our circumstances be bigger than ourselves. We have been deprived of our teenagehood experiences and normal and efficient ways of learning. Dreams and goals were put on hold. Some had to leave everything to find a better future. Today, I applaud every Puerto Rican adult, including myself, for never giving up, for always choosing hard work, knowledge, and fighting for their goals, dreams, family, friends, and their island. I exhort every student or young adult in the Puerto Rican community to take every obstacle or difficulty and turn it into a learning experience. Don't let anything or anyone define you or what you do. Like I mentioned previously, don't let circumstances and difficulties be bigger than you. Thank you.
Ooh, beautiful, thank you. Would anyone like to read this slide? You're all welcome, anyone can join us.
I can continue if you.
Great.
When I was in high school, all I could think about was being with my friends, what I was going to do in my free time, and where we were going to eat. I didn't have to worry about working, studying, or the future because I had my parents helping me. Now, I do think about my future. I have worries, but it doesn't bother me because I do it for my future and my future family. I'm now interested in studying and having a good job, also building a house for my future family. I don't have many real friends, but I'm grateful and pleased with the ones I have. As they say, it's not about quantity, it's about quality.
Yes, thank you. I can read this one. Changing Dreams. In high school, I saw myself at Juilliard, reciting a monologue so intensely the crowd would be at the tip of their seats. I would shed a last tear, have a standing ovation, flowers. I would take a bow, and then the school bell rings, and I would walk over to math class, which I was failing badly. Would someone like to read this slide?
I could read it.
Thank you.
Realizations. Although I sometimes miss high school days, it is undeniable that college is an experience from where I have learned more than classes. It has shown me how to manage time better and has shown me a glimpse of what adult life can be. Academically, college is more challenging despite the flexibility.
Beautiful. Thank you. Who would like to go next? I know we all like to read. Would you like to continue?
Sure. The beauty of
Wonderful.
growing.
Thank
Yeah. Everyone who knew me in high school needs to meet me again. I'm now practically independent. I have developed new interests, and my mindset is completely different. Looking back at my life, I can see the growth and learning that has taken place. I've come to appreciate the value of family in a much better way.
you. Beautiful. Thank you. A parent's perspective. Who would like to read this slide?
I'll go ahead.
Wonderful. Thank you.
My premature entry into the life of a full-time mother, full-time student, and wife was significant transition. Presently, I continue to present challenges that I often feel I cannot achieve. As an adult, we have so much on our shoulders and worry about our finances and health and all this stress. We all want to grow as a kid, but now as an adult, you realize all the responsibilities that come with the adult title.
Yes, thank you. Social landscape post high school. Who would like to read this?
I'll read it. I've met new people. The possibility of relocating to a different city or country has altered the dynamics of my social connections. While I still treasure my old friendships, the scope and depth of my social relationships has evolved.
Beautiful. Thank you. A message to the next generation. I can read this one. I want my second graders to look up to me and know with confidence that knowledge is a powerful key. No matter who they become in life, they must remember that having a purpose will lead them towards a happier life. A message to young people in high school. Anyone want to read this one?
I'll go.
Great,
I
thank you.
would tell them not to give up their studies and that when they finish the fourth year, it will be one more goal achieved in their lives.
Wonderful, thank you. grateful. Would anyone like to read this one?
These experiences have helped me develop teamwork skills that have prepared me to continue facing and learning everything related to my career. I am grateful for the opportunities I have had to learn with my professors and share with my friends at school and university.
Beautiful. This is the last one. Who would like to do the last one?
I could go.
Thank you.
Message for inspiration. Study sometimes can feel overwhelming, but when you look back at all the journey, all the knowledge, and all the opportunities that become upon you, you'll be so proud of yourself. Just remember not to quit, preserve, and always be humble.
Yes, beautiful. Woohoo! We did it together. Thank you so much, everyone, for your beautiful voices and your beautiful help. I just think it's such a beautiful message. I really wasn't expecting such positive message from the young people. I thought, I don't know why, I just assumed everybody would be complaining, maybe because I complain too much. But all these beautiful words, I hope that they've served to inspire all of us. And thank you all for your participation.
I hope that as many of you as possible have the chance to go to Utuado. It's part of La Yupi, but it's a part of La Yupi that many of us don't know very much about. So there are lots of wonderful things happening in Utuado. And again, it's not just a question of us becoming more aware of what's going on in Utuado, but also um, taking a stand in terms of some of the plans that have been put forward by the university to close some of our campuses. And one of the campuses that they are threatening to close is Utuado. So again, we are always very, very grateful to the input that our colleagues from Utuado have been able to provide into to these symposia. So thanks once again. Okay, we have time for another break. But before we do, any questions or comments on the presentation from Utuado? Let's give them all a great big clap. Questions, comments?
I want to thank those students who did practice, even though they didn't speak today. It's a giant step to speak in front of people at a symposium, also knowing you're being recorded, and yet they still showed up and they showed that support and that consideration, and they did practice all week with me, so I appreciate them so much, and I'm thankful to them also for being here, and to all of you who stayed around during the lunch hour as well. I hope that we can always reconnect at the symposium. That's my dream, that every year we can come back and see how everybody is doing through the symposium, and I thank you to the professors who set this up. To everyone, saludos desde la montaña, un abrazo bien grande, a big, big, huge hug from the mountains.
Okay, and we have a message from the students saying that they were trying. They've been trying, but the signal hasn't been good. So some of them haven't been able to hear what's been presented, and others haven't been able to speak. I know that some of them have been coming in and out because their signal is going down. So I invite them back in, but then in a few minutes, the signal goes out again, so they have to come back. So I think the students wanted to participate, but they were having technical difficulties. So just as Professor Kuobong is having technical difficulties this morning, the students and the colleagues in Utuado are also having technical difficulties. So again, these are the hurricanes that we're facing, and we all find our own creative ways to deal with them and find life in spite of living in a death-seeking system. Okay, so let's take another little break so people can get ready for the presentations in the afternoon. It's now about 10 minutes to 1, so just shortly before 1, we can come back I'll have everybody back and have their presentations up, starting at 1 o'clock. See you in 10. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. We're still recording this session. We had a great morning session, and welcome to the afternoon session. We'll wait a few minutes to see if everybody, to wait for everybody to get here. Professor Kwabong, has the technical difficulty been fixed, or are we still getting an echo? Let's see if we're still getting an echo. Are we still getting an echo? No, it looks like, can we hear you, Professor Kwabong? Oh, now it's muted. I guess there are still technical difficulties there, but in any case, we'll be able to do the presentations as we did them this morning. Again, here on the screen, you can see the presentations that will be done this afternoon. We have 3 sessions, one from 1 to 2, another from 2 to 3, another from 3 to 4. While you're presenting, please feel free to read directly from the slides. Don't feel pressure that you have to do a meta presentation that's somehow incorporating what's written in the slides as embedded in some other narrative. You can read directly from the slides. Since we have such limited time, it may be wiser just to read from the slides to make sure that you fit into the time frame. Okay, let's get started. Our first presentation is titled Expectations of Perfection, Depictions of Generational Trauma in Disney's Encanto. It will be presented by Itza Hernandez Giovanetti, and I will project that onto the screen in a minute. Okay, Itza, you can have the floor.
Thank you very much. So like the professor mentioned, today I'm going to be talking about expectations of perfection, depictions of generational trauma in Disney's Encanto. Okay, so first off, we need to understand what trauma is. So what is trauma? The effects of overwhelming and extraordinary experiences that leave their victims in a state of helplessness and thereby undermine their sense of personal efficacy, their relational capacity, and their ability to psychologically integrate the upheavals of life in meaningful ways, which leads us into generational trauma. So what is generational trauma? It's a secondary form of trauma that results from the transfer of traumatic experiences from parents to their children. So when we take a look at past Disney films, right, we see other situations where there's been generational trauma, but in previous films, these previous generations have been vilified. And some examples include the Evil Queen in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Lady Tremaine in Cinderella, Scar in The Lion King, Mother Gothel in Tangled. These stories the focus of these stories was on having the protagonist overcome their trauma without paying attention to what caused this trauma to be passed down from generation to generation in the first place. So we're going to be taking a look at Encanto because the recent films recognize that previous generations are also victims, and it emphasizes the root of the problem. So getting into Encanto, I'm going to try to not spoil it too much in case there's anyone who hasn't seen the movie, but inevitably there are some spoilers. So Encanto showcases how Abuela Alma, matriarch of the Madrigal family, is a strict perfectionist due to her fear that if everyone does not serve and protect their community in a certain way, horrible things will happen to the family. So there's a magical house, there are some magical powers, and she's afraid things will go wrong if people are not perfect. Where does this come from? Well, losing her home and husband in the Colombian Civil War is what caused Abuela Alma to constantly put pressure on her family to keep the house's magic going. It's the fear of that happening again that causes her to set such high standards for her family. She worries that if the miracle ever fails, they might be in the same desperate situation again. So we get to understand her situation and how that affects the plot of the story. So the grandchildren are burdened by the thought that their gifts will not be enough to keep the family together. These expectations are slowly wearing them down. And we see a couple of different examples of how it affects the family throughout the film. Especially it affects Mirabel. Despite not having a gift, she also tries to save her family from falling apart. She is led to believe that she is the cause of the destruction of their home and their magical gifts. However, she later realizes that their family and house are falling apart because of the unreasonable expectations Abuela Alma is putting on her children and grandchildren. So towards the end of the movie, Abuela Alma then apologizes to Mirabel and affirms that her granddaughter was right. It was the grandmother's fears that destroyed everything. Okay. So another important thing to mention is that the reason why a lot of people resonate with this movie is because of how inclusive it is, right? Because unlike most classic Disney animated films that solely focus on European-centered stories, recent films such as Encanto highlight the diversity in our world. This includes showcasing different cultures and countries, which they do in this movie, right? And so I have a couple of quotes that emphasize the importance of diversity, inclusion, and just representations in movies. The first one says, Encanto shines a new light on Colombian culture since it breaks away from the negative stereotypes we all know about surrounding its tragic past of violence related to drug cartels and terrorist groups. The other one says, it's safe to say that this movie is a significant step not only for Colombia, but for people of color, Latino communities, and cultures across the world that struggle with intergenerational trauma of violence and forced displacement. Okay. So in conclusion, as seen in this film, each generation has tried to protect the next, but because they were so protective in doing so, they created the conflict they were trying to stop. So we saw how Abuela Alma faced some difficulties in her life, and because we were able to understand where these difficulties were coming from, we were able to see how that affected her family. This film does not excuse or forgive previous generations' actions just because of the trauma. The characters achieve forgiveness because they acknowledge that they did wrong. This willingness to grow is what sets this film apart from previous generations of generational trauma. Characters saw their mistakes and made and grew. They saw the mistakes they made and grew from them. This is really why this film has been so healing for so many people, right? Because in other films, like we mentioned, the generational trauma just makes the previous generation the villain. Nowadays, we're seeing this more human approach to solving our issues, working on them, and being able to heal from these past situations. Okay. And that is it from me. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for staying within the time limits.
I know that's really important. So I tried my best to keep it brief.
Yeah, but that's just part of this symposium. So we have a lot of presentations and a lot of really good presentations, but unfortunately, we have such limited time that we have to limit the speakers to an unreasonable 13 to 14 minutes. But in any case, you stayed well within the time. So thank you very much. Okay, let's go to our next presenter. Okay. Our next presenter is Gabriela Oglar Boros, and the title of the presentation is Trauma-Informed Children's Literature, Helping Children Deal with the Fear of Community Violence and the Fear of Climate Change. Let me get this in a slideshow mode. There we go. Okay, I give the floor to you, Gabi.
Thank you, Professor. Good afternoon to everybody. As Professor Faragla said, this is my theme is trauma-informed children's literature, helping children deal with the fear of community violence and the fear of climate change. So a few months ago, a group of psychologists, educators, and social scientists working with the Puerto Rico Science, Technology, and Research Trust and studying the impact of violence and climate change on the children of Loíza approached me and asked me to address these issues by writing illustrated children's storybooks. Social violence associated to drug dealing, arms trafficking, alcohol, and illicit drug consumption is affecting people in many parts of the world, but especially in isolated human communities, mostly populated by underrepresented minorities. These communities are resource depleted in many ways, including low income, limited access to education, medical, and social services. Puerto Rico is not an exception to this general trend. One example occurs among the people of the municipality of Loíza, where generations of families have been affected by the pressures of arms and drug stealing that often involve siblings or parents, and as a result, children grow in environments surrounded and impacted by violence. Similarly, another challenge is climate change. Climate change is affecting the world in many ways, but especially human communities that live close to shores because they're threatened by the increase in frequency of storms, hurricanes, rising sea levels. These communities are often, impacted because of where they are geographically. And another example would be the community of Loíza, who not only has been dealing with, rising tides, but also they're still dealing with the aftermath of Hurricane Maria in 2017. So why did they approach me? I'm a children's book author, sorry. And I had previously published a successful children's book titled Carlitos el Cobito quiere escuchar el mar that explained a complex environmental issue with fun storytelling. So in the case of my book, it was about noise contamination on the beach and respecting people's kind of space and sound space and just like general space. And the illustrations, another point that I think was interesting for the creators of this project were the illustrations of my book, which were created by Paulina Sucre, represented the rich cultural and racial diversity of Puerto Rico. So having worked on that book and being able to transform a sort of very complex subject more simply for children, I strongly believe that storytelling is the tool we need to work as a bridge to be able to connect these complex things and to be able to explain them to children. And here you can see a mural that was drawn in Piñones, Loíza, that I had the opportunity to visit. This is a tutoring center for children there. So my goal was to develop trauma-informed stories that would help local children confront the fear of different types of violence, firearm, physical, domestic violence, and the fear of extreme climate events, and hopefully help them to be able to regain some kind of control and security the next time that such situations arise. Dr. Maria Isabel Cos Guzman, who was the team psychologist and collaborator for this project, and who I interviewed several times to be able to write these books, created 10 principles of trauma-informed practices. I will go into the details of 6 principles that were most relevant for the writing of these stories. So number 1, understanding trauma and its impact. Understanding that toxic stress affects people's cognition, emotions, and behavior, and therefore what happens in childhood will have repercussions throughout life. This is true for children and for adults as well. Many of the behaviors and responses that seem destructive or inappropriate in the present can represent adaptive responses to past traumatic experiences. Number 2, promote safety. Number 3, ensure cultural competence. This was really important to us because we wanted these children to be able to see themselves represented in the pages of these books. Next slide, please. Number 4, share power and responsibility, which is promote democracy and student and citizen participation at school and at the home. So it's sharing power and decision-making at all levels. Number 5, resilience is built through relationships. And number 6, that's very important and was, crucial for writing these books, was recovery is possible. Understanding that recovery is possible for all people, regardless of how vulnerable they may seem. Instill hope by providing opportunities for participation, so about empowering these children and these communities, by facilitating peer support, focusing on strength and resilience, and setting future-oriented goals. So in order to write these books, we visited Loíza, different areas. We visited hospitals, we visited schools, we visited tutoring centers. And here's a few pictures of our visits. The Puerto Rico, so who was there? We were with the Puerto Rico Science Technology Research Trust team. The 2 illustrators for the 2 stories were also present. And we had the opportunity, me as a writer, had the opportunity to interview these community leaders, a school social worker, government officials at the Centro de Servicios Integrados de Loíza, which is one of the pictures here. And it was just pivotal to be able to make these stories genuine, right? And to really be able to represent these voices, I needed to be like a sponge and be able to absorb everything that this community, felt was important to them, so that I could transmit that in the stories. All right, so the story for the community violence, I'm going to tell you guys a little bit what it ended out being about, right? So using a bit of fantasy, humor, and representing the social and racial diversity of Loíza among colorful illustrations, discover how Paco and Tito confront loud and scary monsters with the help of their family and school support team. So you can see this is a page, this illustration here is one of the pages of the book. So in kind of a more abstract way, the decision that I made to represent violence as monsters, as noise monsters. So as you can see here, each monster represents kind of a different type of violence with a different sound and different colors. Okay, and here's another full page. I'm so excited to see this because these books are still currently being developed. So this is where we have the 2 children here, Paco and Tito, and this is when the Vejigante Victor shows up, and he kind of empowers them and lets them know, and he represents the cultural richness that Loíza has and the traditions that Loíza has, and he helps these children come back and feel safe again, even when they are going through situations of violence. Okay, and for the second story, whose title is, I forgot to mention the first story, the title is Los Vejigantes Valientes. The next story, which is about climate change, the title is Juju. And so representing the cultural and racial diversity of Loíza among colorful illustrations, meet Sophie, her family and friends, and discover Juju, a little piece of a hurricane that she's hiding in her backpack and that is escaping and wreaking havoc. Here we have a full page illustration. This one is still in process, but we can clearly see Sophie there in the middle, and her sister and her family, and how they've created a family emergency plan and are taking action to become prepared for the next storm or hurricane. All right, so I would very much like to thank the people that make this project possible, especially the Puerto Rico Science Technology Research Trust for, trusting in me and my work. Dr. Maria Isabel Cos Guzman, who was the expert in trauma and who I interviewed and called many times to be able to write these stories, and the dedicated efforts of both illustrators, Rosa Colón Guerrera and Adriana Garcia Soto. And thank you all very much for this opportunity to present and share this project.
Thank you. Those 2 presentations really go very well together. And so again, they're revisiting some of the points that we were making throughout the morning. And I guess we'll get to that in the comments and question sessions that will follow this next presentation. Okay, so our next presentation is by Emily Hernandez Giovanetti. It's titled Teaching Empathy and Critical Thinking Using Dr. Seuss's Books in a Puerto Rican Classroom. I'll give the floor over to Emily.
Great, good evening, everyone. Like Faracas just mentioned, I'm going to be presenting on this topic. So children's literature is fundamental in students' education process, especially because it can teach them to think critically. Developing their critical thinking skills helps students become active members of society. It is important that the material that is taught in classrooms encompasses critical thinking that better fits the needs and issues of Puerto Ricans. Not only does this give students a chance to flourish as global citizens, but it also allows them to join the planning process to better Puerto Rico's future. So this was my theoretical framework. We have Paulo Freire's critical pedagogy. Freire encourages and believes educators must abandon the educational goal of deposit making and replace it with the deposit of the problems of human beings and their relations with the world. I also use Ivan Illich's deschooling. In deschooling, Illich explains that most learning is not the result of instruction. It is rather the result of unhampered participation in a meaningful setting. And I also use John Dewey's Learn by Doing. Instead of passively observing the world, Dewey proposes the idea that learning should be an active process where the learner faces obstacles and overcomes them through action and active manipulation. And as you get to see, these are the specific areas that I covered for each one of the educational theorists. For Paulo Freire, we have the tenets: problem posing, praxis, and dialogue. For Ivan Illich's guidelines, we have questioning assumptions, curiosity and creativity, and learning webs. And last but not least, in John Dewey's Learn by Doing, we have pragmatism, child-centered, and interdisciplinary curriculum. And I also, in specifically with what I'm going to be talking about, the story that I chose, I'm going to be talking about as well why racism and implicit bias was important to include in this lesson plan as well. Grousvold defines racism as hierarchy of superiority/inferiority determined by color, ethnicity, language, culture, or religion. Just because Puerto Ricans are raised as mixed, it does not mean Puerto Ricans do not discriminate against each other. And just to cover the definition of implicit bias, when we have attitudes towards people or associate stereotypes with them without our conscious knowledge. And so the lesson plan that I created was basically outlining the story The Sneetches by Dr. Seuss and how it could be used in a 10th grade ESL classroom to address the topics of racism and implicit bias. And so the plan that I specifically wrote was crafted following the Department of Education's English program content standards, grade level expectations, curriculum framework, and the findings as well of my research and investigation. The purpose of this lesson plan was to create a safe space where students could learn about real issues affecting their communities and think critically about them. And one of the main conversations was initiated through a Think, Pair, and Share activity in order to promote critical thinking. So in case anyone has not read The Sneetches is a book about two kinds of Sneetches: those with stars on their bellies and those without stars on their bellies. The star-belly Sneetches don't like playing with the plain belly Sneetches. The star-belly Sneetches think they are better than the plain belly Sneetches. Along comes an entrepreneur who, in exchange for money, will place stars on the plain belly Sneetches' bellies. This sets up an arms race in an effort to remain special and superior. The star-belly Sneetches pay the entrepreneur to remove their stars from their bellies. This leads to confusion about who had stars and who didn't. In the end, the star-belly sneetches and the plain-belly sneetches realize that they are all sneetches and they are all the same. And these were the questions that I developed to be used in the think, pair, and share exercise that can be done in the classroom. And for this exercise, students would be paired up with a partner and they would discuss these questions together, and then they would share their responses with the rest of the class. And these questions are: what was the book about? How are star-belly sneetches similar and different from the plain-belly sneetches? How is racism present in the book? Can we see the same issues discussed in the book in real life? How? What does Sylvester McMonkey McMean, which is the entrepreneur, represent, and why does he charge the sneetches for using the Fix-It-Up Chappy, which is a machine that removes or adds a star to your belly? In our world, who are the plain belly sneetches, and what privileges do they have compared to the plain belly sneetches? What did the sneetches conclude at the end of the story, and what did you learn from reading this book? And as you can see, this is how the story ties in with the educational framework, the educational theorists and their frameworks, and how it aligns with them. And as we can see, it covers almost all of the different components that these educational theorists specialize in. And here we get to see more in depth of how can we actually see these all aligning, specifically with the different elements in detail with aspects that we can find from the story. I'm not going to be reading it here just because we don't have a lot of time, but feel free to take a picture of this slide or even contact me and I can send you this slide so you can see it with detail. And something that was also important for me to include was Puerto Rico's Department of Education's English program curriculum framework that believes that transversal themes are important and should be integrated into the classroom because they are key components of interpersonal relationships and teach critical thinking skills, right? And as you can see, almost all of them are covered in this specific book. And to conclude, as you got to see, the story focuses on developing readers' critical thinking abilities. It also incorporates elements of Paulo Freire's tenets, Ivan Illich's guidelines, and John Dewey's principles that are found in the text. And this story should therefore be included as part of the Department of Education's curriculum. Thank you very much.
Okay, we happen to have a little more time than usual. So please, left over for questions and comments. So any questions and comments? But first, let's give a round of applause to our presenters. And let's see if if anybody wants to ask a question or make a comment to any one of them. That is to Itza, to Gabi, or to Emily. I don't see anything in the chat right now. Okay. All right. So again, if we're talking about boxes, colonial boxes, and we're talking about colonial borders and these artificial borders that have been set up to make sure that all that we do as academics or artists or teachers or people in the sports arena or all the different arenas that we've talked about since this morning, that we stay in our boxes. Everything that we do stays in our boxes, that it never really opens up a space for any meaningful change in society, that keeps all the dominant systems in place. And another artificial box is the box between children's literature and adult literature. Another artificial box is the box between cinema and the arts, as we discussed before, and academics. So yeah, I think that we're really here talking about border crossing. So if we think about traumas, okay, we've been talking about traumas since this morning in under many different forms. And then here, these three presentations talked about specifically trauma of civil war in Colombia, or the trauma of violence in the community and climate change in Loíza, and then the trauma of racism and the traumas that are experienced because of racism. So all of these are part of the ruination that we talked about in the morning that results from colonization. But when we are talking about these traumas, we've also been talking about resilience. We've also been talking about the capacity for people in the Caribbean and the African diaspora in general to actually take these traumas and turn them into opportunities for healing, opportunities for not just healing, but going beyond healing to do some very, very creative and subversive work. And I think we can see in all three of these presentations examples of that creative and subversive work. But the problem is that, again, this work in these three presentations is happening in the arena of first mass media or cinema, that is with Encanto. Secondly, in the area of the classroom, which applies to the context of the children's books, and then also in terms of mass media, in terms of mass children's literature, in the case of the Snitches, as applied in the classroom. And I think that this is a major, major challenge and a major subversive and creative reaction to another one of the ruinous mechanisms of colonization, which is the fact that colonization eventually doesn't just affect countries and communities, it starts to affect families, and it starts to break down some of those avenues that people had access to in the past, especially children had access to in the past, in terms of those traditions of resistance and creativity being passed down from one generation to the other. So we mentioned in the morning how bodies that are gendered as female have played a major role in the Caribbean in passing down those traditions, whether it's linguistic traditions, whether it's culinary traditions, whether it's child rearing and life ways kinds of traditions, orientations towards the world, ways of thinking, speaking, and acting in the world. And so, again, while past generations have children who were born in past generations had the advantage of being in extended families that inhabited the same house or the same area. These children had access to these female ancestors, their grandmothers, their great-grandmothers, their mothers. Even if the mother had to work, there would be aunties and grandmothers around. So that these traditions of creativity and subversiveness in the face of a death-seeking system, these women who found creative and subversive ways to create life in the face of a death-seeking system had the chance to pass on these creative and subversive traditions to their children or their grandchildren or their nieces and nephews, etc., etc. But again, colonization has reached the point where it's invaded all of our houses. And so that we're no longer living in extended families. We're living in nuclear families where both parents are working. And the only ways that children have access to anything from past generations, some of the few ways, are through the mass media and the classroom. And of course, the mass media and the classroom are places that have been thoroughly colonized. So when we hear presentations by people like Gabi and Itza and Emily, we're talking about the exceptions rather than the rule, okay? So the average kind of thing coming out of Hollywood is not about a creative and subversive way to deal with civil war and generational trauma. It's quite the opposite. And the average thing coming out in children's literature or literature in general that's popularized is not about challenging systems of domination like racism, as which was the focus of Gabi's wonderful, of Emily's wonderful presentation, and of that very subversive book by Dr. Seuss, who actually has been attacked viciously by those people who feel threatened by that type of activity, which is not supposed to happen. Just like Marianne was talking about in her presentation when she was talking about Bad Bunny, how people who do try to cross those borders eventually get disciplined and put back in their boxes. And so Dr. Seuss is an example of somebody who would not go back into his box, okay? And some of those subversive writers and content creators at Disney are also being put back in their box now by the same people. So when you look at what's happening in Florida under Governor DeSantis and how books are actually being banned from the schools and how Disney is being attacked. I'm not going to say that Disney doesn't have a past of perpetuating systems of domination and paradigms of domination, but as soon as some people within Disney have tried to get out of the box, you can see how they're being slapped back into the box, and Disney is being attacked because of that. And the rhetoric that that's coming out of that sector of US society is getting more and more, is resembling more and more the rhetoric that came out of Nazi Germany. So in Nazi Germany, books were burned. Any books that didn't state where you had people speaking out of the box, trying to actually critique systems of domination, taking stances that are not normally taken in academia. Those books were burned. So if they start burning books, Dr. Seuss's books will be burned. And also these types of productions by Disney. Snow White will not be burned, but Encanto will be burned. That will be eliminated. And then I'm unfortunately, Gabi, if they start burning books, I think they're going to start burning yours too. But that's a compliment. That's the compliment. That means your books are really worth something and doing something real in society. So anyway, we started out this morning talking about hurricanes. We started out the morning talking about disruptions. We started out the morning talking about colonial ruination. And again, here we see a qualitative step forward in the ruinous process of colonial domination. And now our households, our family lives have been completely colonized to the point where that intergenerational transmission is being disrupted more and more and more. Grandmothers and aunties no longer live in the same house as their nieces and nephews and grandchildren. And then mothers are too busy working to pay the skyrocketing rents in Puerto Rico and to just make ends meet, that they don't have enough time to pass on enough of these very subversive and resistive traditions to their children. So there's a great need to start to develop content in the arenas where children are being socialized, like the school, like the mass media, for this kind of content to be available to children. And so this is a very, very important step. But again, teaching has been traditionally in Western society, the activity.
No, Professor, we lost you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, you're back. You're back. You're back.
Am I back? Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, teaching, just like cooking, is an activity, and child rearing. These are all activities that have been done traditionally through bodies that are gendered as women, as female. And so these activities have been traditionally looked down upon. And so when you look at the canon of world literature, it doesn't include much in the way of children's literature. And when you think about how the kind of cinema that academics talk about, they don't talk about Disney too much. Okay. In other words, we are all disciplined to stay inside these boxes. And so again, we have to also recognize that these arenas, the educational arena in general, especially primary and secondary education, the arena of children's literature, the arena of popular culture and popular cinema. These are arenas that we need to intervene in, because if we stay in our academic boxes and say, well, you know, children's literature, that's not real literature, or, you know, Disney, that's not real culture, or Dr. Seuss, that's not, I mean, I can't teach a course on Dr. Seuss in my, or I can't have a unit on Dr. Seuss in my syllabus at the university. As long as we continue to hold these attitudes, then we're seeding those, we're giving all of those important areas of socialization over to the book burners, okay, to the far right, because they are thoroughly involved in all the areas of popular culture, and they are thoroughly involved in making sure that popular culture perpetuates all of these discourses of domination. So these are very, very important arenas that we're talking about, but because these are arenas that have traditionally been catered for by bodies gendered as female, academia and all of those very male-dominated, prestigious disciplines tend to look down upon them, tend to erase them, tend to ignore them, tend to marginalize them. So again, this fits very well into what we were talking about this morning. Okay, after that long diatribe by me, I'm wondering if there are any more questions or comments on these three presentations. The one on Encanto by Itza, the one about the children's books that are focused on Luisa by Gabi, or the one on Dr. Seuss by Emily. Yes, Gabi.
Yeah, I wanted to comment. I thought it was really interesting, you know, because we're all talking about these sort of children, you know, children's literature, but also children, you know, narrative in the sense of the movie Encanto. And so I wanted to ask Itza, because I thought it was really interesting. I was talking about trauma, and she was talking about healing trauma, how this story kind of helped heal trauma. So I wanted to ask her a kind of in terms of that, and why it's in like you said, that was one of the things that was really important about Encanto. And then I wanted to ask Emily a little bit more. I thought it was fascinating, everything that you did in the classroom. And I wanted to ask you what were, because the questions, you gave us the questions, but what were kind of the children's responses? What did they say when you asked them who were the star belly and who were the plain belly? I'm just really curious.
Okay, Itza first.
So yeah, I mentioned that something that makes Encanto really special is how a lot of people who have been watching the movie has helped them sort of really understand things about their own lives, right? Because I feel like as Hispanics, right, generational trauma is something that, yes, it's inevitably been part of our lives, right? Due to our history and due to everything that Dr. Faraclas was mentioning, right? And because in the movie, we see that they don't treat Abuela Alma as the villain, as just like the bad person, the one who's out there to ruin everything. It's her fault that everything's falling apart. It's her fault that people feel this this need, people have this need to be perfect, right? They don't just call her the villain and just leave it at that, and we need to get rid of her, we need to push her away, we need to kick her out of the family and just get rid of that because we don't need that kind of energy or pressure. That's not what they do in that movie, right? Like I mentioned, in other previous Disney movies, we see that this person who is sort of projecting their own trauma onto other people, they're just sort of cast away. They end up either dying in the movie, right? Or they could just get up. It's a children's movie, of course. They don't actually usually die, or they don't tell you that they die, but you know they've just been eliminated from the movie, right? So in this movie, we don't see that happening. We see how the family works out their issues and how Abuela Alma recognizes the fact that I did wrong. You know, I went through this very difficult situation, and because I didn't want you to go through that difficult situation, I was putting so much pressure on people that I was just pushing them away. This, you know, it was wrong of me to do this, and they apologized. And of course, there a lot of people have speculated regarding the movie that it happened sort of like really overnight in the movie, like it was just like too quick. So I'm hoping that in the future, you know, more movies or more films, more text, I should say, right? Because I'm talking about a movie specifically, but we just saw, you know, other wonderful examples that you two presented about in books. So we're hoping that more text in the future will be a little bit more realistic in, you know, how they deal with the situation, but just the initiative of having this villain, right, recognize that they did wrong and that their own past was affecting the way that they were behaving is already a huge step in the right direction, and can already help us, you know, understand that, you know, if we have our grandparents or an uncle or an aunt or a parent that we sort of see our situation mirrored in this movie, right, we can understand that the right thing to do is not to push them away or just to deem them as this isn't fixable, this isn't going anywhere. It can all be changed through conversation, and it could all be changed through mutual understanding of what happened and how we can work together to overcome this situation in order to heal and in order to move forward together as a family, as a society, as just a group of people, right? So hopefully that answered your question.
Okay, just a couple of things in relation to that. That just two very colonizing tropes that get to one degree or another challenged in something like Encanto, in a film like Encanto. Because one is the trope of erasure of the past. Okay, so in other words, part of colonization, a key goal of colonization is to get us to forget our past. In other words, because our pasts are rich in traditions of subversion, rich in traditions of sovereignty, and all of that, the dominant systems need to erase all of that, all memory of that. So we don't remember the sovereignty that all of our ancestors had, because we may someday want to claim that sovereignty back. They want us to forget that that's even possible. Okay, that's number one. But number two is the trope of perfection. So again, if we're talking about colonization, we're talking about a Platonic view of the world. And so in the Platonic view of the world, this world should be, is not worthy of our scientific study. What we should be studying is the perfect world that lies behind this world that we experience. So this idea of perfection is another very poisonous colonial trope. So those are two interesting tropes that are addressed in Encanto. Okay, Itza, sorry to make you wait so long. What were the kids' reactions?
Emily.
Oh, Emily.
Yes. Well, actually, it's very interesting because that's a pretty popular story, and a lot of children and also young adults are familiar with it, but they just haven't studied it with the critical thinking lens, I guess we could say, through that lens. Because a lot of the times kids are taught in school, like, yes, racism is bad, but they don't really have a clear understanding as to why, because that's just not really taught as heavily in schools. So it's really, in my experience, it's really mind-blowing for them because they get to understand and see the consequences of perpetuating racism and implicit bias in society and what it does to people. And it's a way for them to realize, to see the effects, and then know, okay, that's something I do not want to do. I don't want to keep doing what a lot of other people have done. And they come to this conclusion on their own, just making connections between what's in the text and then the experiences from real life, even from their own experiences.
Good. Okay, we have some questions from Professor Kouabong. The first one is, and this is open to all of you, when you talk of teaching children critical thinking, because all of you do to one degree or another, do you mean to say training children to think like adults rather than like kids? So when we teach children critical thinking, are we trying to teach them to think like adults rather than as children? Are we trying to change their thinking from being one typical of children to one typical of adults? Anybody got any answers to that? The three of you, either any of you have an answer to that one?
I would
Okay,
like to
Isa?
So I think the goal would be not necessarily to make them think like adults, but to make them think for themselves, right? Because usually children tend to be really curious and they tend to ask a lot of questions. But through schooling, unfortunately, a lot of times we discourage them from asking questions and we discourage them from going too deep into a subject, right? We tell them, you know, you don't need to ask so many questions. This is just the way things are, right? So I would say that critical thinking, when taught to children or when taught in school, right, in a school setting, the goal is not to get them to think as adults. The goal is to get them to think by themselves and for them to arrive at their own conclusions in order for them to make sense of the world that they're living in. So at least that's my opinion.
Emily, Gabi, anything you want to add to that?
I would say that incorporating material like this and that's taught in the classroom to encompass more critical thinking skills to better fit the needs and issues of Puerto Ricans nowadays, right? Not only give students a chance to flourish as Puerto Ricans, but also as global citizens, and for them to know that they are a part of the conversation and they're a part of the planning process to better Puerto Rico's future. And they are able to participate and become agents of change in order for them to change the reality that people in Puerto Rico face, right? Because at the end of the day, children are the future of the country. And I think it's really important because it allows them to understand that their voice is important and they have the power to change things.
Gabi, any reactions to Professor Kouabong's question?
Yes, I very much agree with what Isa and Emily have said. And I would just like to add as well that I read this really interesting book about children and climate change, in which they interviewed children in very extreme climate situations, such as drought in Africa, the tsunami in Philippines, etc. And then the children that were better managing these situations, where they had been given opportunities to actually participate in the recuperation of their communities, where they were given a chance to speak, where they were given a chance to make a plan and things. And so I think a lot of times when there is an emergency, sometimes people just push children to the side and they forget how they very much have a voice and how children sometimes think very differently than adults. So we want to encourage them to think as children, not as adults, but to have their own voice and also, like Itza said, to have their own thoughts. So yes.
Okay, well, talking.
Yes,
We got our welcome, welcome,
this
Professor
is a different
Kouabong.
computer.
Yay.
Thanks to Michael. Michael came to my rescue. Yes,
Thank you.
I just wanted to say that there is the new book, Caribbean Children's Literature, that came out, edited 2 volumes. One of the editors, our former student from our English department. I have an essay there that looks at Caribbean children and natural disasters. And there I discuss some of these traumatic ways, and also the participation of children, both in the preparation stages towards mitigating the disaster and then the post-disaster period in Caribbean literatures. So, and I got a picture book by Esmeralda Santiago. That is one. It's a collection of picture stories called Reconstruction. And in the Reconstruction, Santiago does this picture story about San Felipe and how the children were involved in Puerto Rico, etc., etc., etc. So what you guys are doing is really excellent. I think we need to pay more attention to children's roles rather than, as Gabi has just said, we forget of the children. It's always that the children play major roles in preparing, helping their parents before the storm strikes or the earthquake strikes, if they know, and after and during. They are not alone. And we never talk about the trauma the children go through. It's always the adult that we think, oh, blah, 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 blah. So I think this is great. And with the Dr. Seuss, I use Dr. Seuss in my literature and ecology class. The first one we look at is, what's it called? The Lorax. That is the very first one, not the 2012 musical, which has no relevance as far as I'm concerned, but the original 25-minute children's one. And I tell you, students kind of shed tears just watching, and then they rewatch it again now with a more adult eyes. So they're able to, and I said, children, my kids watched it and they actually taught me a lot about it as children, not me as an adult. So we also learn from children's critical ways of perceiving and seeing the world. So great work, great work. Of course, my understanding was, you talked about racial differences in Loisa, and I said, rather than talk of racial differences in Loisa, is it not rather color rainbows of color rather than race? Because this word race is problematic in a place like Puerto Rico. That's a comment I'm just making as an outsider.
Gabi, do you have a response to that or a interaction with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we wanted to be very supportive or very like conscious. We wanted to be very conscious about the diversity of race, or like the diversity of the, and maybe we don't want to use that word race, but yes, we want to talk about the diversity of people of Puerto Rico. So in my first children's book, I wanted children to be able to see the book and find people that had pink hair, purple hair, dreadlocks, all kinds of skin tones, all different types of ages. Because sometimes in children's books, we don't see, you only see the grandparents or you only see the parents, and you don't see like the whole picture of what the reality is when you go to the beach in Puerto Rico, that you really have like this huge difference of people, including also people that have different types of, oh look, Jose is showing a picture of my book. I don't know, you can't really see it that well, but so I also really wanted to bring that to this book, especially honoring the culture of Loíza and the people of Loíza. So I had the opportunity to speak with these community leaders, and they would tell me, like, we want to have beautiful hair. Our children here, they use hair like in braids and in different ways, and we want to see that. And I was like, yes, you do want to see that, and yes, I also want to see that, absolutely. So you're right, maybe race is a word that can sometimes be used, in a non-positive way, but in all times we really just wanted it be about like representation and diversity with these stories.
Right. Okay. So like the way that race functions is by creating a false opposition between white and black, and then putting people again into boxes. So either you're going to be boxed as white or boxed as black, and that's a particular dynamic that didn't really occur in the first 200 years of Puerto Rico's history. But after that, especially during the 19th century that we discussed with the racialization of plantation slavery in Puerto Rico as well, it comes in. So Puerto Rico's history, as Professor Cuabon mentions, is so complicated when it comes to questions of racialization of people. But in terms of boxes, again, the other boxes that are imposed by colonialism is the very difference between child and adult. So in other words, childhood becomes a totally separate thing from adulthood. So in other words, something that was fuzzy, that had all kinds of transitions, where there were all kinds of contradictions, become this sort of white and black kind of thing, an opposition again, a very colonial type of opposition. You're either an adult or you're a child. So that that is another part of colonial ruination, this separation, this apartheid between everything adult and everything child, that has to do with children. And another intersection here as well is the division between work and play. So again, if you want to be a serious academic, you deal with adult themes, and you deal with themes that have to do with serious things like work. Okay, and so if you talk about Dr. Seuss and you talk about Encanto and you're talking about children's literature, you don't get taken seriously in a lot of academic circles. But actually, the work that you're doing is very subversive, because it's breaking down those boxes, breaking down that, it's healing a lot of that colonial ruination. And so it's actually much more much more valuable in terms of society than most of the work that academics do, because most of the work that academics do is just to meet the expectations of a certain group, a certain in-group of people who police other people on how they should think and how they should speak and how they should act in the world. And most academic literature will not be read in 50 years' time. It's all just a bunch of, yeah, it's all just a bunch of, but people who do cross borders and people who dare to touch on themes like popular culture and sports and cooking and children and play and all of those themes, though, that's the kind of work that's really going to touch people, really going to make a difference in society. And that's the kind of work that's going to be read in 50 years' time. They're going to say, oh, but there were these people who actually were thinking out of the box, and they had a much bigger effect on society. And and I find much more meaning in what they wrote than what Chomsky wrote, or the latest big name in critical theory wrote. Okay, I think it's time to move on to our next session. Okay, so let me get the next presentation up on the screen. Okay, so our next presentation is titled Dear Unicorn, Discourse Analysis and Caribbean LGBTQIA+ Identities on a YouTube channel. It's going to be presented by Isaías Calderón.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be participating in this symposium. My name is Isaías Calderón, and as the professor mentioned, I am doing discourse analysis and Caribbean LGBTQIA+ identities on a YouTube channel called Dear Unicorn. Legally registered in Barbados, Butterfly Barbados was founded by Raven Hill, a transgender woman born and raised there. Having been harassed and dehumanized by law enforcement in defense of herself before and after her arrest in 2016, Hill came to understand that her well-being depended less on monitoring her own language and more on asking for basic respect from others. Butterfly Barbados emerged as a result of a focus group facilitated through LGBTQIA+ meetings that catered to and provided safe space to marginalized LGBTQ+ communities of Barbados.
Okay, 1 minute.
Dear Unicorn is an LGBT-based web series transmitted out of Barbados since 2019 and a project of Butterfly Barbados. The founder, Raven Hill, and co-hosts engage and connect on various topics of intersectionality of LGBTQIA+ issues and how they can be traced back to systems of domination. In challenging hegemonic discourse and in an attempt to promote and provoke institutional change, Dear Unicorn aims to explore the interlocked sequences of diverse lives in the context of evolving institutions. Dear Unicorn makes it clear that its goal is to represent LGBTQIA+ individuals in society, and in the process, the channel has featured a number of content creators, hosts, and even well-known media personalities. The subjects discussed are meant to articulate a message that promotes LGBTQIA+ people and their interests. One of the channel's goals is to make the viewers understand that LGBTQIA+ communities are multiple and diverse. The channel is also keen on highlighting the importance of discourse in both perpetuating and challenging anti-LGBTQIA+ oppression. On Dear Unicorn, LGBTQIA+ persons can be seen to be doing important discursive work, which reflects their understanding of both stabilizing and destabilizing discourses related to their social conditions. On the channel, LGBTQIA+ people articulate their life experiences within context of inequality and subordination imposed by the vestiges of colonialism and its institutional apparatuses. They do so in order to generate meaning that can open up spaces for resistance, for resistance to systems of domination. The themes of identities and self-expression have been foregrounded on Dear Unicorn to allow LGBTQI+ persons to express their opinions clearly. The guests on the channel narrate their life experiences and reiterate that a focus on assumptions related to identity repertoires can play an important role in the processes of affirmation and harm reduction for LGBTQIA+ people. Dear Unicorn supports Bajan LGBTQIA+ communities by attempting to create spaces for inclusive recognition and the use of inclusive language in Barbadian culture. Although Barbados has garnered a reputation for being one of the most LGBTQIA+ friendly territories of the Caribbean, the vestiges of colonialism have left the island afflicted with the moral panic of the Victorian era. In that light, Raven Hill and her co-hosts often use storytelling to normalize the diversity of LGBTQIA+ identities and experiences, so that the viewers can connect emotionally, creating empathy and understanding. These stories recount typical challenges and experienced by LGBTQIA+ people, such as prejudice, mental health issues, and family rejection. By providing assistance for overcoming these challenges, Dear Unicorn acts as an educational and informational platform. The messages of Dear Unicorn has far-reaching social consequences. The channel helps to break down prejudices and misconceptions by offering a platform for open and honest discussion regarding LGBTQIA+ matters. Monroe warns of the wide range of social disadvantages, including exclusion, stigma, and discrimination, which are faced by people who do not fit mainstream conceptions of gender and sexuality. Being excluded has far-reaching impacts on marginalized groups, such as LGBTQIA+ Bajans, whose access to social networks are facilitated by Dear Unicorn. Dear Unicorn's emphasis, on courteous language and validating identities may affect viewers' behavior. When viewers witness positive language and respectful relationships, they are more inclined to emulate these behaviors in their own lives, thus contributing to a more inclusive society. Furthermore, the channel's advocacy work can make LGBTQIA+ people feel noticed, valued, and less isolated, and the resulting sense of belonging can improve their mental health and well-being. In conclusion, Dear Unicorn is a YouTube channel that contributes significantly to public discourse on LGBTQIA+ identities and experiences in Barbados and beyond. It empowers and educates its audience through representation, storytelling, and an intersectional approach. The channel's material has societal ramifications that go beyond the screen by helping to make society more inclusive and understanding. By evaluating the discourse in Dear Unicorn, we can see how powerful online platforms can be in affecting debates about LGBTQIA+ issues and establishing a sense of belonging for people who may feel marginalized in other settings. Thanks very much.
A big clap to Isaias, okay? And if you note down any questions or comments you might have on Isaias's presentation for after the next two presentations, let's go to our next presenter now. Okay, our next presenter is Alejandra Zapata Torres, and she will be, presenting on, sorry about that. Let me get that up on the screen for you. Sorry, Alejandra, I'll be right there. Here we go. Okay. Here we go. She'll be presenting on the erasure of Puerto Rico's African past.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Are you guys able to hear me?
Yes.
Oh, perfect.
Sorry
Okay.
for the delay, Alejandra.
That's okay.
Then go
Don't
ahead.
worry. Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alejandra Zapata, and today I will be talking about the erasure of Puerto Rico's African past. So the complexity of Puerto Rico identities and cultures is a result of centuries of diverse indigenous, European, African, and North American cultural influences. Leconte and other academics state that in more cases than not, the significant role of people of African descent in shaping the history, politics, economics, cultures, and languages of the Caribbean and the rest of the Atlantic world has been consistently and systematically ignored, trivialized, underestimated, and otherwise erased in academic teaching, research, and writing. But this mission extends even beyond academia to the entertainment arena and pop culture as well. So I'm going to mention a few examples of erasure of African roots in academia, pop culture, and entertainment. I'm going to start with Antonio Pereira's book, Insularismo, Ensayos de Interpretación Puertorriqueña. So he remains one of the most cited analysts regarding the ethos of the Caribbean literature. And in this particular book, he discusses the primary influences that have shaped Puerto Rican culture and character. Throughout his book, Pereira underestimates and even demonizes African influences over Puerto Rican cultures and identities, effectively asserting that most of the defects in Puerto Rican character can be attributed to African influences. I decided to include a few excerpts from chapter 1 of Pereira's Insularismo. I'm just going to skim over a few of them. So the one that I wanted to highlight was entre una que es la superior y la otra que es la inferior, referring to the black race, el mulato será siempre elemento fronterizo, participante de ambas tendencias raciales que acrecentará más o menos de acuerdo con el tipo que escoja para un segundo enlace, el mestizo, el blanco o el negro. El mulato, que combina en sí las dos últimas y generalmente no suele ser una cosa ni la otra, es un tipo de fondo indefinido y titubeante que mantiene en agitación ambas tendencias antropológicas sin acabar de perfilarse socialmente. Vive presente, inmediato, defendiéndose de todos y de sí mismo, sin volcar pautas en el ambiente, prudente e indeciso, como el hombre que se encuentra acogido entre dos fuegos. Necesita una mayor cantidad de reservas de una u otra raza para resolver su situación. Es hombre de grupo que colabora y no crea que sigue y no inicia, que marcha en fila y no es puntero. Por lo general, carece de fervores para ser capitán. And then in the next excerpt, la raza superior que daba inteligencia y el proyecto y la llamada raza inferior que aportaba obligatoriamente el trabajo ofrecían características de difícil casamiento. Entre ambas mediaba la distancia que separa el hombre libre del esclavo, al civilizado del bárbaro, al europeo del africano. La raza blanca era legislativa, la negra ejecutiva. Una imponía el proyecto y ordenaba, la otra ofrecía el brazo y obedecía. Mientras la europea era dueña de vidas y haciendas, la africana no podía disponer ni siquiera de sus sentires. Tampoco tiene que preocuparse por nada, ni pensar en cosa alguna, ya que la raza mandatoria se ocupaba de pensar por todos, conservando de esta manera su fuerza moral sobre el conjunto. So these are very like strong words. As I was reading this, of course, he's clearly demonizing the African culture and saying that those that are white are superior and those that are black are inferior. Go ahead, yes. Another example that I wanted to include was their African heritage being omitted from school curricula. So I am presently a tutor for intermediate level students at a private school in Ponce, and I have observed a recurring pattern whereby the study of Puerto Rican history tends to omit or downplay our rich African heritage. As exemplified in the textbook titled Atlas de Puerto Rico y el Mundo, the curriculum often centers on indigenous, Spanish, and North American influences, leaving little room for the exploration of Puerto Rico's African roots. This is just a few pages of the book. You can go on to the next slide.
Wait.
Okay. Oh, sorry. That one, yes. Alas de Puerto Rico y el Mundo begins its... Oh, no, yes, you can skim over the book. You can move on to the next slide. Yes, there we go. Alas de Puerto Rico y el Mundo begins its account of the colonial history of the island with Cristobal Colon's discovery of Puerto Rico at the beginning of the 16th century. And then from there, it jumps ahead all the way to the Spanish-American War at the end of the 19th century. So the only section in which African influences are mentioned at all is a section of the Atlas that deals with demography, where it briefly states that in Puerto Rico, there is a racial blend of Spanish, African, and Taino people. But that's basically it. Another example that I wanted to include was the erasure of African roots in politics. So Pedro Albizu Campo, the former president of the pro-independence Partido Nacionalista Puertorriqueño, practically erased African influence in his analysis of Puerto Rican cultures and identities in a speech that he gave of a concepto de la raza. So for him, the creation and existence of a monolithic Puerto Rican culture and identity could be completely attributed to influences from Spain. In this view, Puerto Ricans are, in a sense, simply Spaniards living on the island of Puerto Rico. So this is his speech. If you skim over it, you're going to see that he mentions Spain over and over and over again, but he never mentions African influences or culture in our culture in Puerto Rico. So moving on to erasure of our African past in entertainment and pop culture. So many of us are familiarized with the Miss Universe pageant, which is marketed as a celebration of women of all cultures and backgrounds, and as a way to empower them to realize their goals and create opportunities for success. We can see different elements of Puerto Rican cultures in many of the costumes, what they know as traje típicos, worn by the candidates over the last decades. So I'm not so sure if you're able to see from the collage, but you can see trajes típicos that resemble indigenous roots. We see jíbaro, we even see the rooster, peleas de gallos were considered part of a culture, but now it's illegal. We even see pirates, the Observatorio Recibo. We see Walter Mercado, but we have never seen, African heritage in nearly 70 years, which is going to bring me to the next slide. So 69 years later, finally, in 2021, Miss Puerto Rico Michelle Marie Colon's costume depicted La Bomba, which is an element of African culture bequeathed to us. So it was the first time in 69 years that a Miss Puerto Rican contestant for the title of Miss Universe represented our African roots on an international stage. Before we continue to Preciosa by Rafael Hernandez Marin, I did want to mention that this year's candidate of Miss Puerto Rico, I just saw yesterday that in her traje típico, in the back part of her costume, she does have some black men playing percussion instruments. So I think finally it has been included again, after so long. But this I just learned yesterday, so that's why I didn't include it. Okay, moving on to the song Preciosa by Rafael Hernandez Marin. So it was written in 1937, and I think we can all say that it is considered by many as the unofficial anthem of Puerto Rico. So in it, he describes the attributes that make Puerto Rico's culture preciosa. In doing so, he includes prominent adjectives to refer to our Taino and the Spanish roots, but at the same time, he literally erases any reference to our African past. I did want to highlight some of the lyrics of this song. So when referring to Spain, he mentions, y tienes la noble hidalguía de la Madre España. When referring to the indigenous people, he says, el fiero cantillo del indio bravío. And at some point, he does mention, sé de sus hembras trigueñas, but from my perspective, trigueña is neither black nor white. And it's just like, sé de su hombre trigueña, which is, like, it doesn't use the, big adjectives like it did for the Spaniards and for the indigenous people. And when he does finally mention negra in the lyrics of the song, it's with a negative connotation. So, con negra maldad. So, in conclusion, African influence in Puerto Rico is evident in our everyday lives, from gastronomy. So, those of you who like mofongo, gandules, those are part of African roots. Music, bomba y plena, we all know that. To phenotypes, to language. So when we use words like chévere, sandungueo, even dengue and banana, those are from African roots as well. And even to some of our religious practices like Santeria. But unfortunately, the considerable role of Africa in our complex identities and cultures has been omitted, trivialized, and underestimated by academics, politicians, educators, and even entertainers. From my perspective, there has been a slight improvement in appreciating African roots in Puerto Rico, but there is still a very long way to go in giving our African heritage the acknowledgement and valorization that it deserves. And that's the end of my presentation. I hope everyone enjoyed it.
Let's save your questions and comments for after the final presentation in this particular session, which will be which I'll flash up onto the screen in a minute. Okay, our next presentation is by Jose Rivera Belaval, and it's titled Calinda, More Than Art, but instead a cultural bridge for Afro-Trinidadian traditions. I'll give the floor over to you, Jose. Jose, are you there? Let's see.
You're not on mute.
Oh, we can't hear you, Jose. Maybe
You hear me now?
Yes, now we can.
Sorry. Okay, perfect. Take two. So, good afternoon. My name is Jose Rivera Belaval, and I will be presenting on Calinda, stick fighting, martial arts, and dance form. Could you present the next slide, please?
Yeah, I think there's a delay. Yeah.
Calinda stick fighting is a traditional Afro-Trinidadian martial art and dance form, which historically served as a form of resistance and secret cultural bridge for the enslaved African populations. There are many variations on the name, which reflect the diverse linguistic influences over the African diaspora. Calenda with an A seems to be prototypically practiced in such Caribbean territories as Martinique, which have been influenced by French imperialism, and where people speak French lexifier Creole languages. Calinda with an I is prevalent in regions influenced by English colonization and where English lexifier Creoles are spoken. Finally, Calinda with a C is often found in regions which have undergone Spanish colonization. These variations in the names used for this practice not only represent the fluidity and adaptability of language and culture, but the nature of these art forms' evolution and influences over the Caribbean region at large. Next slide, please. Calinda is, like many things in the Caribbean, a product of hybridity. West and Central African traditions and cultural practices of various ethnic groups, such as the Yoruba, the Igbo, and the Congo-Angolean peoples, were forced into enslaved labor in Trinidad and Tobago during the transatlantic slave trade. They contributed to the emergence of Calinda. Components of these traditions include specific dance movements, rhythmic drumming, and spiritual rituals. They establish a strong link between the art form and its African heritage. For example, you can see similarities that can be traced back to African rhythms and expressive dance styles, such as the Yoruba Geled, the Igbo Akbaka, and the Congolese Makossa. These movements incorporate fluid gestures, footwork variations, and a style called body isolations, which often mimics aspects of nature's animals or daily activities even. These reflect the close connection between African dances and cultural storytelling that emphasize spiritual expressions. Next slide, please. So drums and other rhythmic instruments play a fundamental ritualistic role in Calinda. The music is characterized by complex rhythms and beats, which contribute to the dynamic nature of the performance. These are again reminiscent of the musical traditions in various West African cultures. According to the ongoing research of Shaina Revelle-Thompson of the University of Toronto, ka, the first part of the word, is a Southern Kikongo and Dumdu nominal diminutive prefix, which is also used in French lexifier Creole languages, while linda and lenda means drum. So you can see that the fighters would encourage the drummer to play louder and hype them up by upcoming stick fighting match, saying, give me K, give me Ka, and people would drum louder. So they do this in typical African call and response exchanges. The comeback takes place in a circle ring called a gael, with sticks around 4 feet in length, more or less. When the drumming begins, one fighter would throw their stick into the ring, and a challenger answers by jumping in and waving their own stick around. The fighters taunt each other for entertainment of the crowds before and during battle. You can also see this in piqué, which is also references in other musical genres of the Caribbean. Elements of Calinda martial arts or repertoire are also found in West African self-defense practices. Most likely, these techniques were passed down by professionally trained fighters who were skilled in combat in Africa before being enslaved. Combat techniques in Kalinda involve invasive maneuvers, striking, and grappling, which parallel self-defense and martial arts practices in West Africa. Evasion is the most indispensable skill in Kalinda. If the person that got hit on the head and bled, that's the person that lost. The ability to parry, leap away, and dodge to avoid blows from opponents would have been the difference between life and death in the actual battle. While we can hypothesize that these warriors were trained in the use of varied weapons, swords, spears, before their captures and enslavement, they used what was available to preserve their traditions and transmit their knowledge, hence the use of the stick or bois, which means wood or stick in French, and the French name for bois duels, which is Kalinda duels. These techniques must have been passed down through generations as means of protection and adapted and modified to reflect the challenges faced by the enslaved populations, attesting to their ongoing resistance. Combining elements of combat, dance, and music served not only as a physical training for self-defense, but even as a form of self-expression. Next slide, please. Kalinda also holds a deep spiritual significance. There's a singer or a chanter that serves to engage the audience in a call and response and praise singing, as well as in requesting the right music or song to bring forth the warrior spirit. The rhythmic movement and symbolic hand and weapon gestures often carry unique ancestral spiritual references. So if the grandfather of a fighter did a certain gesture, the fighter would do it to honor his ancestors, serving as a channel for the spiritual empowerment of the warrior and a connection to ancestral beliefs. It is even believed that certain warriors would have their stick mounted or infused with the spirits of their ancestral warriors. Through these processes, the enslaved could evoke a sense of spiritual strength and protection, covertly reinforcing their faith, even in the face of their oppressor, and contributing to the preservation of cultural identities through the transmission of ancestral knowledge and beliefs. In a broad sense, Kalinda has created a rare space for spiritual freedom for enslaved communities and their progeny. Through communal gatherings, knowledge can be transformed into a support system for transmitting cultural tradition, folklore, history, and spiritual narratives. Next slide, please.
I think there's just
There's a small glitch.
There's a delay, don't worry.
Not surprisingly, Kalinda has faced different restrictions and prohibitions throughout the years due to its association with resistance and defiance. Bans were enforced all the time as a means of attempting to control and subjugate the enslaved population. Colonial authorities undoubtedly knew cultural practices like Kalinda were a potential threat to their authority, and these restrictions were no doubt aimed at erasing connections to the ancestral traditions and cultural identities of the enslaved African populations. One of the main examples will be during the Cambule riots of 1880, in which the government issued bans on certain elements of carnival, including the carrying of Kalinda sticks. Kalinda fighters physically defended people against the colonial British police brutality, proving how essential Kalinda was as a form of self-defense. Cambule refers to the season when the sugarcane fields were routinely burned, which involved physically demanding labor on part of the enslaved population, and it also allowed for people to mix from different regions. Despite such bans and attempts at suppression, the practice of Kalinda persisted and survived in underground and marginalized spaces. Next slide, please. As a vehicle for preserving and transmitting ancestral practices, Kalinda has allowed the enslaved and their descendants to embrace their ancestral identities. In that and other ways, Kalinda has represented a form of resistance against the dehumanizing conditions of enslavement and marginalization. By celebrating their identities, enslaved Africans and their progeny have been able to assert their humanity and agency, despite their oppressors' continuous attempt at subjugating them. The enduring significance of Kalinda lies in its contribution to the survival and eventual resurgence of ancestral traditions through a celebrated cultural art form which has become both a symbol of resistance as well as proof of the enduring strength of Afro-Trinidadian communities. Thank you so much.
Okay, a round of applause for all three of our presenters in this session. Okay, so now it's time for questions and comments for Isaias, Alejandra, and Jose. Any comments or questions? Okay, is that, yes.
I have a comment.
Okay, yeah, go ahead, Felix.
I'm seeing that there's a lot of topics that have to do with history and erasure, but we have no idea that this is coming from within. And seeing a presentation like from Alejandra is just, that kind of gives us a lot to, reflect on, because it's, you see that it comes from the outside sometimes. Oh, people do not remember our history, but coming from our own people that deny it in a certain way that everybody accepts it, and it's the normal, it's like the norm. That's kind of harsh, Yeah, we have to do something about it, and it has to be quick, because this is not going good. I mean, there's an effort, but we need to do a lot more as a community, and as our whole culture. I don't know, it's just kind of worrying. So it just puts it all on perspective.
Well, look on your screen. You see Professor Kouabon, and you see our hero, Angel, who has fixed the technical problem in the seminar room. But they're sitting in the seminar room in what building? The Pedrera building.
Yes.
Okay, so in other words, we've got a long way to, like Alejandra said, we have a long way to go.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah. Okay.
Good example. Good example.
Yeah. Yeah. More feedback on those three presentations.
I'm happy with the presentation on the kind of veiling of the African presence in a lot of the educational texts. Though it's also there, it's not like it's totally banned. I'm saying this because when I arrived in Puerto Rico, I lived in Avenida Barbosa, and I wanted to know who this famous Barbosa guy is. And I learned he was a big politician and of African descent, of course, African Spanish descent also, if you want to put it that way. And he had to choose between racism as practiced in Puerto Rico of his time, when he was founding his party, one of the founding members of one of the top parties, or choose Hispano Americanismo as an identity. And he realized that politically it would not do him good if he started talking about racial issues or race issues in Puerto Rico. Because the sponsors, the powerful big families with land and other things would not sponsor him. But if he said he was Spanish, forget of Africa, forget of China, forget of anything. I am Hispanic. I'm from Spain. Spain is the motherland. And that is how he got into the position he got into. So I'm happy that this the presentation basically talks about this, and young people are fighting back and trying to reintroduce the multiple histories, the multiple genetic codes and whatever that makes up what Puerto Rico is. I was also in Canada when the Miss Universe, Miss whatever, came out to say, I am, what do you call it? I'm mulata. Okay, in order to win the Miss World, because there was an extremely very dark Black woman from Trinidad or somewhere who everybody was rooting for. So she was warned that unless you include your Africanness, you are going to lose. You will be second. So she claimed it. Maybe it came from the heart. Maybe it was political, a smart move. I don't know. But as you all have been saying, nothing has been erased. They may have been put at the back of the house. But there is a proverb which says, what is whispered behind the house marches to the front of the house.
Yes. And again, all three of these presentations had to do with erasure and undoing of erasure. So Isaias talked about how Dear Unicorn undoes a lot of the erasure of LGBTQIA plus lives in Barbados and the rest of the Caribbean. Of course, Alejandro was talking about the erasure, and then, of course, nothing is ever completely erased, and those memories live on, and those traditions of that we've been talking about of subversiveness and of creativity live on, and they resurface in sometimes the most unexpected places, like Miss Universe pageants, and then Jose was talking about how calenda can be seen as a way of resisting erasure as well. But another thing about Jose's presentation was about spirituality, and this is another box. So we've talked about all the boxes that keep us from doing really effective work. The box that keeps us in, the box of adulthood that keep us from touching on themes having to do with children. The box of academic seriousness that keeps us from talking about arts or sports, but also keeps us from talking about spirituality. Spirituality is another colonial box. So before colonialism, there were no boundaries. People moved seamlessly or celebrated simultaneously. Spirituality, sports, arts, academia, or philosophizing, historicizing, dancing, martial arts, cooking, all of it was together. But colonialism divided each one of those into little boxes. Predictable little boxes, controllable little boxes. So we lost our sovereignty. We forgot about our sovereignty. We'll never lose it, because just like anything else, it's never completely erased, but we forgot it. We don't recognize it. We don't value it. And because we've been disciplined to stay in our boxes. And the only people making the connections between the boxes are the ruling classes, not in our interest, but in their interest. Eugene, first question, Eugene, and then Piero. Eugene, are you silent? Are you muted?
Yes, because I find it more effective to speak when the microphone's off. All right. So anyway, question for Jose Velawal. All right. Just out of curiosity, did Kalinda, was it practiced in the Hispanophone Caribbean, in Puerto Rico, República Dominicana, Cuba, or did it mainly stay?
So there's different names for it, but you got to remember that whenever a person was being problematic, it was still valuable as cargo or as anything else. So they would move them from island to island. That's why there's still different names for the same thing. There is a version of stick fighting in Haiti. There's versions of stick fighting in the French Anglophone Caribbean. They're not exactly the same, but there's no mistaking that they have parts of the same roots. So they were practiced. In Puerto Rico, stick fighting per se, I don't know of it. I haven't found yet evidence of calenda, but honestly, I've been going through such a rabbit hole of research that I don't doubt that I may find some at some point.
Let me know. Give me a call or write me. Hey, I found.
Okay, will do.
Yeah, if you don't find it in Puerto Rico, it would likely be found in Cuba or in places like Palenque in Colombia, or some of the areas of Venezuela and Colombia that have long traditions of maroon settlements, etc., etc. You could probably look in areas of the Caribbean coast of Central America. So in other words, in the areas of the Americas that were colonized by the Spanish, I think you'll probably find some evidence of it there.
would just, I
But
don't mean to
maybe
leave you
others
with-
of you have
Yeah.
knowledge of it in those areas. Yes, I think Jose wanted to add something.
There is something that can be perceived as evidence because Kalinda evolved also in music. So you can see evidence of Kalinda in the Piquet tradition, in Calypso, and in Soca. And there are movements in or traditional bomba which emulate the same movements that the fighters were doing in the rings. So you can see when the person is going backwards in bomba, that is a movement that is used for evasion in a ring of Kalinda. When I was watching the videos of many fights, I'm like, these people could be dancing bomba. So while I don't have any physical evidence to trace it, I do see it.
Yeah, and you know, this again are the boxes. So in other words, why do we insist that it only counts as calenda if it's part of a martial arts tradition? It's just like the comment, the presentation or the comment before about Michael Jordan. I think Eugene made that comment where he has a friend who is an artist, sculptor, etc., but that that has this incredible respect for Michael Jordan and how other people in the art world look down on the sports world. And again, these boxes. So in other words, if you're an academic, you don't talk about spirituality so much. You're not supposed to, or you're not supposed to talk about martial arts. But if you do talk about martial arts, you can't mix that with music. In other words, box after box after box after box. In other words, we're being disciplined, just like you discipline a dog, so that you keep the dog under your control, or at least the illusion of your control. And so that's what these disciplines do to us. They keep us under control. Yes, Professor Kwabong.
I was thinking of, is it possible, that's to Jose, one of the first novels, The Trinidad Awakening, that is by, what's his name again? In which though calendar and stick fighting is banned, it transitions into the church spiritual Baptist tradition and whatnot, and then it comes out as Kaiso and then Calypso, etc., etc. Now I'm thinking of Puerto Rico. Is it possible that instead of the martial arts or physicality of, we can look at competencia, controversia as a kind of verbal stick fighting? Because in West Africa, we have that kind of abuse poetry in which you actually go out. The more ridiculous you are in abusing your opponent, the more you win.
Definitely. You
Because
can see
your opponent has no choice but to laugh at how you have ridiculed them so much that they just have to laugh at themselves. And then you go and sit under a tray and drink palm wine together or pito together.
Definitely. You can see even the bombas that are very traditional here, where we kind of make fun of each other. It's, for me at least, it is definitely evidence of an evolution of it, because it's in the tradition. Even if they took out the physicality of it, it's still the same movements, the same kind of entertainment for the crowd. There's a chanter, there's a call of response. People, everybody in the audience is participating in it. It may not be physical anymore, but I believe it's still related.
Because I now remember the novelist, Lovelace, The Wine of Astonishment, and Errol Hill's Man Better Man. It's a drama in which it's actually written for this kind of dramatization of the stick fights, and calypso songs or calendar music then sung in praise of the mighty little, etc., etc. So yes, it has not died because it's finding its way through literary texts, in drama and in fiction.
And right now, like, there is a resurgence of it. There's even a school of Kalinda in Trinidad and Tobago, because it went back to being something kind of like once a year in Carnival. But
Yeah.
there are people who are descendants of Kalinda fighters who are trying to bring it back. Just this last year, one of the founders died, and there was a big memorial service. There's a very good documentary that I watched while I was doing research, and it's based on the life of this person that died. So it is
Just
in my references.
A quick note. I think as you expand the research, you have to consider limiting your influences to Africa only, because the Indian influence, there is stick fighting, the dance styles, and the stick fight. So you have to look into the Indian subcontinent, the East Asian, East Indian influence also.
Yes, sir. In Trinidad and Tobago, there's a big population of descendants, and there's also a Hindu word for Kalinda that it means something else, but there's definitely some sort of converters.
Yeah.
Jose, if you remember the title of the video, could you put it in the chat so if people want to
Fire.
Okay, Pero, thank you for your patience. You've been waiting and waiting to ask your question. You had your hand up so long ago, but unfortunately the conversation went in many different directions. So now is your chance, Pero.
It's a wonderful conversation. So I think it worth the wait. Well, first of all, I wanted to say hi to Jose, because after it was one of my Italian students at the University of Puerto Rico. So I'm more than happy to see him. Like, he always, you as a teacher, you don't know where if you're doing well. So I'm so happy to see him, and actually I'm so happy because now I'm almost a PhD candidate at the University of Texas, and I investigate Loíza Spanish as a non-Creole, right? So a non-decreolization process and hypotheses and Germán de Granda and all the stuff, right? So I think that I love his representation, and I think that probably you can also make a comparison with capoeira, for example, also to expand, right? Non just, also to Lusophone world. You can move to capoeira, and then when we were talking about other places, probably you can consider Los Cocolos in the Dominican Republic, the English-based. Still, they moved a lot, so it's like, but Cocolos is something that you can see, and also what I would like to say is that, for example, in my Loíza research, what I found is that a place like Cueva María de la Cruz in Loíza, that it's now está bastante de moda in the last years, was a place where the slave population used to hide in order to practice bomba, right? And what Professor Faraclas was saying, it's totally true, because like it's a mix between dance, religion, but like also martial arts. No, they make like a camouflage with martial art, but and say no, it's a dance, right? And so, but like, of course, it probably doesn't apply to bomba, but I don't remember actually who said that like the difference between Jamaica, Haiti, Cuba, and the rest of the Caribbean is one stop. It's like similar people, of course, well, from the Western Africa, but like just one stop. So they didn't decide where to disembark, right? So I think that this is kind of that you can consider, and that's why probably you can get until Brazil and analyze the capoeira, because it's very similar. I didn't know about Kalinda, so I'm very impressed because it looks like capoeira, and also I can just share with you later some bomba lyrics that has like el coro in African languages, and then it says in Spanish, tanto tiempo en Puerto Rico y no puedes hablar así. So it's like they accept to kind of learn Spanish, and in a kind of exchange, they can still practice bomba, religious, practices. So it's something that I think this is a kind of observation, a very long one, I'm sorry, but it's like I'm very, very happy for this Caribe Plurilingue. So thanks, Professor Paraclas, and all the people to be here.
And Professor Cuabon. But Piero,
Yes,
I
exactly.
put 2 books in the chat that may be of interest to you in relation to this very, very important research that you're doing, because the research that had been done in the past on language practices in Loíza, I think did not really dare to go into certain places, did not dare to get out of the box. So I think that your contribution could be potentially incredibly important, because for students in Puerto Rico, the sources that are available on language practices in Loíza are very much within the colonial box. So I think that you're going to take us out of that box. But to help you get out of that box, these 2 books have some chapters in them that may support you in that effort. Yeah. Okay. Unfortunately, this excellent. Oh no, we have time. Okay, but Isaías. Okay, so we're talking about Calenda in Trinidad and Tobago, but you were talking about another area of the undoing of erasure in Trinidad and Tobago. So in terms of the LGBTQIA+ community. So first of all, can you tell us a little bit more about the founder's story? And then, because I know you talked about the fact that the founder had been arrested. So Miss Gill's story. And then also about the how they put together Dear Unicorn, because again, throughout our presentations today, we've been talking about storytelling and the power of storytelling. And it sounds like in Dear Unicorn, there's a lot of that kind of activity going on. So can you tell us a little bit about those 2 things, Isaías?
Sure. I looked at this story and it caught my attention because if you're not familiar, Barbados decided in 2021, I believe it was, to completely disconnect from the monarchical connection through the Commonwealth of the United Kingdom. So now it's the Republic of Barbados. And that was impressive to me. And then I ran into this story because it's not a common thing for centuries of tradition to just be dismissed and to adventure onto the unknown as a republic. I look at that in the light of Puerto Rico and the local people and their fight or claim for Puerto Rico's possibility of becoming an independent nation and to untie itself from the vestiges of its own colonialism and its colonial past. So that was very attractive to me. And then I ran into this YouTube channel. It's titled Dear Unicorn. And I read about the story of Miss Raven. She pronounces it Hill, Raven Hill, who is a transgendered Barbadian woman. And her arrest, typically when someone is arrested, one immediately thinks they have a criminal behavior. However, she was defending herself in a public space from being called out and abused verbally by other Barbadian men because they knew she was transgendered. And thinking she was going to be protected by law enforcement in this altercation, she was arrested along with her perpetrators. But after her arrest, she was then subjected to the dehumanization of being treated as her biological assignment male after being arrested by police or law enforcement in the jail. She was jailed in a men's jail cell with other men who were also violent to her. So after this came about, instead of silencing Ravenhill, she became a proponent of activism for the LGBTQIA plus community in Barbados. Now, Barbados is a very open, friendly country, but like many Caribbean countries, it is also, or it was also subjected, because she was the head litigant in the derogation of the sodomy laws in Barbados. Her and another gay man, or a gay man, were the head litigants of the Human Rights Watch to strike down these sodomy laws in Barbados. I think that occurred in 2019. So she became very active and very open and outspoken in relation to how these marginalized communities in Barbados and throughout the Caribbean are treated, and how a lot of these people tend to think that because of the way they speak or conduct themselves in public is the problem, and that's how they thought, or how we think we are conditioned. And her argument is, no, that's not the case. We have a right to speak as we speak, to be as we are. And what needs to be transformed is how people perceive us, treat us, and behave around us, only because we deserve to be treated as equals among our community, not as people to be thrown out or marginalized because of who we are.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Professor.
You know, it's interesting too that on the program, one of the most effective genres used is storytelling. So people just tell their own stories. And you know, this is another problem with academia, is that because we position ourselves as experts, we don't allow people to tell their own stories. We tell people's stories for them. And we don't allow the communities that we work with to tell their own stories. We tell stories for them. And so it's interesting that actually what Ravenhill is doing is allowing people just to tell their stories. And then sometimes that's the most effective thing you can do, you know, to really change society. It's just tell the stories.
Right. I was speaking. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to comment that I'm teaching a public speaking class, and I was talking actually in recent weeks to my students about persuasive speech. And it kind of struck me because Ravenhill's efforts are basically just getting people to come along and share in the narrative, rather than to change or make them change in what they have come to believe. Just come share the story, learn the story, participate in the story. Mm-hmm. And that's primarily been her focus. It's not been easy for her, but the story is extremely impressive, at least to me, in becoming an obscure, or becoming from an obscure person to at least be recognized internationally because of her name being the one of the two names in the litigation in terms of the derogation of the sodomy laws in Barbados. It's very impressive, and all she wants is the recognition of her existence along with her community. Yeah. And that's extremely important.
Mm-hmm. Professor Kuabong, I think you had something to say or to ask. Professor Kuabong?
There. No, I was looking at the time, since some of us have 4:30 class. Can you hear me?
Yes.
He's below to me. I haven't
Oh.
seen him in a long time. Profesor, un abrazo.
I just wanted to find out from Piero, no, Isaiah, how is Dear Unicorn story? How does it tie in with contemporary U.S. anti-politics? Let's put it that way, anti-democracy, in which one part of the U.S. is reversing all the rights, all the equality laws, etc., etc.
Well, oh my word. I don't think we have time. Yeah, I don't think we have time for an expansive conversation, but I'd like to point out that I think everyone is aware about how hot the political climate is in the US at the moment, as it relates to equality, as it relates to rolling back progressive measures that had been accomplished. And I was talking, I don't know if I mentioned this to you, Dr. Kuobong, or someone else that on campus, but recently the current Speaker of the House, who is second or 2 seats away from the presidency, was asked in a TV interview what was his world view. And in his response, I was seated, and if I was not seated, I would have probably fallen off my feet, because his response was, just pick up a Bible and that will tell you my worldview. And it's very concerning because he is a white old man or older man, cisgendered man, and he is imposing his views based on biblical precepts that don't apply to everyone or are not accepting of everyone, not just people like Ravenhill, but people who you look at and you think that there is nothing distinctive about them just because of perception, but the truth of their existence can probably be entirely different to what this person and his community think we should all subscribe to.
Yeah. No, I watched that interview and I said, wow, he must be living in Leviticus.
That's the thing. That's the thing. The Bible is so big. And the thing is that, again, as academics, we stay in our box. We don't get involved with spirituality. We don't get involved with religion. In fact, any academic who tries to talk about spirituality is automatically looked at with suspicion. But the thing is that what are we doing? We're giving the whole arena of spirituality over to these right-wing fascists. In other words, they have taken spirituality and run with it. They've taken the Bible and totally twisted every single message in the Bible to their ends. We should be doing the same thing. We should be taking the Bible and giving it our interpretation. Okay, but we're not, because we're in our little box. So in other words, we should be there in the sports arena. We should be there in the Miss Universe contests. We should be there in the children's books. We should be there in the Atlas de Historia de Puerto Rico. We should be there in the arts. We should be there in Disney. We should be there in Dr. Seuss. We should be there in all these arenas. We should be there in martial arts. But we're not, because we're all in our little disciplined, domesticated box. So our voice doesn't get out there. But these right-wingers, these fascists, they're in all those arenas, preaching their message constantly. And that's why we are on the verge of moving into a situation where all of us are going to be subject to being, as Trump said, rooted out like vermin and sent to concentration camps, getting sent to gas chambers. This is what happened under people like Trump during the Second World War. That's Nazism, that's fascism, and that's our future if we stay in our little boxes.
Yeah, if I can say one last quick thing quickly. What the astonishing thing is not that these isolated men espouse these words and their conceived notions. It's what's scary to me, at least in terms of their discourse, is the thousands, if not millions, of people that subscribe to their verbiage, to their manner of thinking. That's what's dangerous and scary to me in terms of our existence.
It's not millions. It's in the United States alone. It's about 30% of the population. So you're talking about over 100 million people believe these things. Whatever Trump says for them, that's the truth. And whatever Fox News says for them, that's the truth. Okay, time for our next session. Okay, this is we're going into our final session now. Our final session. So we only have 2 presentations in this session because the first one is an individual presentation, but the second presentation is a group presentation. So it got 2 slots instead of 1 slot. Okay, in any case, our next presentation is by Frances Rivera Cognier, and it's called African Storytelling, from the traditional to the digital griot and transperformative storyteller. Let me get this onto a slideshow. No, I gotta do this. Okay, here we go. Sorry, Frances.
Hi, I'm just waiting for it to switch over.
Yeah, so am I. There we go. Okay.
Okay, I got it. All right. Hi. So yes, my presentation is about African storytelling, from that traditional griot to its representations in the digital realm, and then some possible transperformative representations on social media. You can move on, please. Thank you. So storytelling is the activity of telling or writing stories using language, vocalization, and/or physical movement and gesture, and it can rely on the audience to co-create the story. You can keep going. So what is special about storytelling in Africa is, firstly, it's rooted in ancient traditions and passed down orally through generations. So tribes and communities relied on oral narratives to educate, entertain, impart moral lessons, and foster a sense of shared identity and culture. Second, it has cultural significance and a role in the preservation of history. And third, in addition to entertainment, it teaches important lessons about everyday life and is essentially a communal participatory experience, and is also a mechanism for social cohesion. You can continue. Lastly, according to Jack Barry, both storyteller and the audience have rights and obligations. Storytellers repeat words, phrases, and stanzas, and this use of repetition makes the stories easier to understand and then recall from memory, which helps the audience to actively participate and become part of the telling of the story. I'll begin with this excerpt. Well, my question then is, who are the storytellers? And I'll first read this excerpt and then explain a little bit. This is from Chinua Achebe in Anthills of the Savannah. And he says that it is only the story that can continue beyond the war and the warrior. It is the story that outlives the sound of war drums and the exploits of brave fighters. It is the story that saves our progeny from blundering like blind beggars into the spikes of the cactus fence. The story is our escort. Without it, we are blind. Does the blind man own his escort? No, neither do we, the story. Rather, it is the story that owns us and directs us. In an interview with this Nigerian writer, Chinua Achebe, he speaks of the role of the writer, and he says that art cannot be in the service of destruction, cannot be in the service of oppression, and cannot be in the service of evil. And he applies this conceptualization to the art of storytelling and to writing. Therefore, storytelling carries a moral, social, and cultural responsibility. So now I'll explain who carries this important role and what it can entail. So the African storytellers are called the griot, and the griots are then the record keepers. In West Africa, storytelling traditions have long served as a means of preserving history and passing down messages through speech, song, folktales, fables, and proverbs. Within this context, the griots emerge as integral figures embodying the roles of historians, storytellers, praise singers, poets, and musicians. Some will take on all of these roles, while others are not necessarily musicians, but will still perform the story and have the responsibility of teaching their history and culture through the story. They have perpetuated the history and traditions of their community across generations, and their vocal talents encompass a range of expressions from praise and satire to political commentary. You can keep going. Griots are often, but not always, associated with musical instruments, and their skills are believed to hold spiritual, social, and political significance. While griots have historically been seen as preservers of society's memory, the modern role of a griot extends to performance and cultural preservation, encompassing both music and spoken word. And just as the griots liken their work to a baobab tree or a living library, their narratives continue to resonate as a testament to the history and culture of the region. An example that some of you might know that has been passed down through griot generations, often through song, is Sundiata, an epic of 14th century Mali. The basic structure of the story is said to bear resemblance to Shakespeare's Hamlet, although Shakespeare's play was conceived nearly 3 centuries after Sundiata. Also, although Hamlet is often identified as the inspiration for Disney's Lion King, Sundiata literally translates to Lion King, which, if you've heard about what happened with the song The Lion Sleeps Tonight, this adds another layer to the deep issues with appropriation. Next, I have an example. This is Baba Ona, an example of a storyteller who uses music and repetition of certain phrases to entertain and integrate participation from the audience. He combines physical movement. He raises both of his hands above his head and has the audience chant whenever he does that, Chikaku Namo. And throughout the story, he prompts them to repeat this name whenever he again lifts his hands. Ultimately, both the storyteller and the audience then perform that story. I don't have the video available to play, but I transcribed like the beginning of the presentation. I'll just post it if I can to the
Okay, let
chat.
me just see if I can get it. I've got. Do you want me to go to the hyperlink or just
No, it's fine.
Okay, I'll just get rid of that one and let's see. Okay, so go ahead. I'm sorry.
I'm just posting like the transcript. Just
Okay.
okay, you can go on. Talking about digital storytelling, other than storytellers being able to share their performances with a large and distant audience and having the option of recording them, as was the previous example, digital storytelling has gained momentum with the rise of social media, providing a platform for African and African descendant content creators to share authentic narratives, address social justice issues, and promote movements in community building. Accessible technology has empowered individuals proficient in social media to challenge negative stereotypes about Africa and create diverse narratives. So, African and African descendant individuals adept in social media are using microblogging platforms to challenge prevailing negative perceptions of the continent as backward and plagued by conflict and poverty. For example, in a 2013 TED Talk, journalist and novelist Panashe Chikumadzi highlighted the challenge of overcoming stereotypes, urging young Africans to counter the dark continent narrative by creating new stories through various media forms. And the image on screen is a screen capture of that talk. Platforms like YouTube and TikTok have supported Black African creators, albeit to a limited extent, and initiatives such as TikTok's TikTok Rising Movement and YouTube's YouTube Black Voices Fund aim to uplift Black voices and provide resources for their success. You can continue. Organizations like Digify Africa contribute to changing global perceptions by fostering digital skills and empowering young people to drive meaningful change. Finally, Professor David Stamps highlights how social media can educate, inspire, and empower Black Americans, countering negative narratives and fostering a sense of unity and empowerment, exemplified by movements like #Black Lives Matter and Black Twitter. He notes that Black Americans who are more likely to engage in online activism utilize social media to share grievances, celebrate successes, address injustice, and raise awareness about cultural issues. So, through social media, Black Americans find a digital haven to counter stereotypes, celebrate their identities, and affect social change. So with all of this information in mind, my argument here is that there are Black content creators, and specifically I am looking into African-American women or non-men who are creating content that records stories of the Black experience in the United States. They are being record keepers of what is happening now and sharing it with their audience, their followers, or those who are able to view them on their feeds. However, I did leave a question mark next to the term griot because although I can speak of these content creators as story keepers and tellers, I do want to be careful and respectful of the term and see whether it can be applicable by using that transperformative marker. So the creators will look and act differently to the traditional griots that I've discussed here, and they don't necessarily use the same performance style. So they may not be using musical elements, although they may include them along with dancing, and they do not employ the same call and response method, although there is a form of doing so asynchronously through duets, stitches, or video comments. I'm thinking of a few creators who use skits or speeches to communicate and educate about a social justice issue affecting the Black community in the US, and typically doing so through an intersectional lens. Those that I've been looking at in particular have been at Clarabelle CWB, at Jasmine JW, but in particular here, I want to highlight at Crutches and Spice and Lene Van E. On the left is Lene Van E, who is a poet, social commentator, and content creator who tackles pertinent social justice issues online. She is best known for her Parking Lot Pimpin' series, which always starts with her signature line, "It's Friday, so I'ma keep it black, but I'ma keep it brief," and is accompanied by a blue and white tea set. She combines fashion, commentary, and intellect to promote varying topics that promote multifaceted aspects of Black liberation. Some episodes include, for example, climate injustice and cultural and political issues, such as recently Ron DeSantis's ban on AP African American history content. And she was recently nominated for an NAACP Image Award for this type of content. And on the right is Imani Barbrin, and her @ is Crutches and Spice, who is a writer, public speaker, TikToker, and a disability rights activist. Her social media content is also focused on the Black woman's experience in the US, but strives to do so through an intersectional lens, focusing on disabled Black women. You can go on to the next one. This slide includes a capture of one of Lene Van E's videos. As you can see here, the caption is, "Somebody said white privilege is when your history is the curriculum and every other history is an elective. 3 words, come on somebody." In this, as with other videos in this series, she says her usual catchphrase, which some of her followers then echo through her comments. And in this particular video, she is discussing Ron DeSantis' statements about an AP African American Studies course as, quote, "inexplicably contrary to Florida law," and, quote, "significantly lacking in educational value." She goes on to detail the great American achievements that owe their origins to the African descended communities and individuals they want others to be blocked from learning about. She performs this by sitting on a chair with props, her teacup and her teapot, and proceeds to tell the story with some sing-songy sections to add emotion and entertainment to the heavy content that she's discussing. So in a different way, this creator is also carrying out a performance, but then for an asynchronous audience. And the call and response is not direct, as was, for example, Babaona's, but followers or visitors to her profile and video do echo these phrases in the form of content, comments, duets, and stitches. So what I'm trying to represent with this example is that there are currently content creators who speak on issues of African descended individuals and tell their stories. And in so doing, giving voice to typically marginalized communities. Imani, who I mentioned previously, also does this. She has intersectional content that speaks on issues faced by Black women with disabilities and speaks on how these intersecting identities create special circumstances that many do not consider. So although these examples do not fit the typical or traditional style of the griot, they have a transperformative function of being keepers of their realities, circumstances, and stories, and choose to tell them online using entertainment methods of performance.
Thank you very much. Let's give Francis a hand. Now we're going on to our last presentation of the day, which is a group presentation. Let me get that up on the screen. There it is. Okay, so there will be many voices in this presentation. I'll give it over to our introducer.
So our presentation is titled Creolization, Language Practices, and Plurilingualism in the Caribbean, Africa, and the Pacific. And the presenters today are Nancy Odewo, Itza Hernandez, Emily Hernandez, Frances Rivera, myself, Marco Torres, Isaias Calderon, and Nicolas Paracas. And we are from the University of Puerto Rico and the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. Colonial era Creole repertoires and varieties, also known as colonial era Creole languages, have often been referred to as new languages by Creolists. In this presentation, we contend that the language practices most commonly associated with these Creole repertoires and varieties by the peoples who were colonized during the wave of Western European maritime imperialism that lasted from the 15th to the 20th centuries are often much older than the language practices associated with the standardized named languages of the colonial metropoles, even though these colonizing languages are seldom thought of as new.
We consider evidence from 3 of the many contact zones where colonial era Creole repertoires/varieties emerged: the Caribbean, specifically Iberian Lexaphyr, Papiamento, in Aruba, Bonaire, and Curaçao, alongside other named languages such as Dutch, English, and Spanish. West Africa, specifically English Lexaphyr, West African Pidgin/Creole on the Atlantic coast, alongside English, French, Portuguese, and hundreds of other named ancestral languages, and the South Pacific, specifically English Lexaphyr, Melanesian Pidgin/Creole in Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu, alongside English, French, and hundreds of other named ancestral languages.
Okay, so what we're talking about are 3 different areas of the world. One is the Caribbean, one is West Africa, and the other is the South Pacific. So let's focus first on the area of the Caribbean that we'll be talking about. It's these islands up here in the red circle: Aruba, Bonaire, and Curaçao. You can see them blown up over here. And as you can see, these islands find themselves in the midst of a very plurilingual, pluricultural, and pluriethnic zone between the northern part of South America, where you can see great linguistic diversity. Each of those colors representing not individual languages, but individual groups of many languages. And then also the island Caribbean, where you have the same kind of multilingual background. Okay, so what would be going on in Aruba and Bonaire and Curaçao before colonization? Well, let's consider the island of Bonaire, which today is called Bonaire. Okay, well, it's in a typical household, your mother might be speaking one home language, like, for example, Galibi. Your father might be speaking another home language, like Caquetillo. So you would be being raised with 2 languages at least. And then in your village, there'd be people who would be speaking other languages. And once you got to the market or involved in any kind of exchange, you would be speaking languages like Island Caribe or Maipure. Okay, now let's go over to West Africa. So now we're looking at the situation here in West Africa. And you can see that, again, we have a very plurilingual, pluricultural, pluriethnic zone stretching from Gambia, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. Each one of these colors represents groups of languages, not individual languages. So we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of languages through Ghana, same thing, and then over to Nigeria, Cameroon, Equatorial Guinea. Okay. And so what would be happening in a typical household in this region? Okay, let's take the Niger Delta. In a village like Opobo, before colonization, your mother might speak a language like Kalabari, your father a language like Kana, so you grew up speaking at least the 2 of those. But once you got involved in any kind of inter-ethnic contact, you would be speaking market languages, pidginized and creolized languages like Market Igbo or Market Ijo. Okay, now let's go over to the South Pacific. Again, a multicultural, multilingual, multi-ethnic zone, which is Melanesia, which is in the red circle here. Okay, And as you can see, it's extremely plurilingual, probably up to 2,000 languages being spoken in this zone. Just like on the coast of West Africa, you have over 1,500 languages being spoken. And we're going to focus on this little corner of Papua New Guinea and look at what might be happening in a typical household there. Well, in a village like Biawa, you might have a mother speaking one language, Duao, a father speaking another language, Dobu. So if you were growing up in that household, you'd be speaking both of those. But as soon as you got to the market, you'd be speaking Kilivila or Hirimotu. Again, a very similar kind of situation where people are speaking 3, 4, 5, 6 different languages.
The critique of Western linguistics advanced by proponents of approaches based on epistemologies from Global South challenged the colonial gaze on the study of language that too often implicitly elevates language practices normalized by standardization such as linguistic imperialism, linguistic competition, linguistic exclusion, and monolinguism, etc., to the level of universals.
For example, Paraclas, Alvarado, Ruiz, Maxwell, and Sabio suggest a number of rereadings of indigenous histories in the Americas that undo colonial erasure. The interconnected waterways of the southern Mississippi, Gulf, Island Caribbean, Orinoco, and Amazon basins constituted a mega corridor along which people, ideas, and goods could and did move with relative ease. Number two, this mega corridor of waterways was far from geographically marginal in the peopling of the Americas, but instead was a major nexus of movements of peoples in all directions.
Okay, so what we're talking about here is a reconceptualization of the history of the region that includes Puerto Rico, includes the Caribbean. So normally when indigenous histories of the Americas, indigenous so-called civilizations of the Americas, indigenous settlement of the Americas are discussed in academia, this region is treated as a backwater. And also because we're talking about regions with lots of water, the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, also the Orinoco and Amazon basins in northern South America, and then the Mississippi and other river basins in the southeast of what's now the United States. These waterways are considered as obstacles to people coming into contact with each other. But the opposite is true. These waterways linked people together. These were never barriers. They were the super highways of indigenous peoples in the Americas. These were the areas where movement was easier, not harder, because boats have been around for the last 900,000 years. Even species of hominins that came before Homo sapiens had boats. So basically, we're talking about an area that's actually extremely important in all aspects of the peopling, the cultures, the languages, etc., of the Americas. And as you can see, because there was so much contact in these areas, you have extreme diversity in terms of language, each one of those colors representing whole groups of languages rather than individual languages, multiple cultures being practiced, multiple ethnicities and identities, multiple identificational repertoires, multiple linguistic repertoires, and multiple cultural repertoires. And now Itza will continue on some of the points that were being made in this rereading of the histories of the Caribbean and the adjacent regions.
This mega corridor was far from culturally marginal, but instead was a zone of creativity, invention, and innovation in key areas from trade to agriculture to architecture. The fact that the peoples along this mega corridor were not incorporated into the pre-invasion imperial civilizations of the Americas is not so much a sign of backwardness as it is a sign of wise and spirited resistance. At the same time, recent findings in the areas such as ancient DNA analysis, and archaeology anthropology indicate that most of human history has been characterized by intense and sustained convivial contact among homonyms, trans-ethnic hybridity, cosmopolitan plurilingualism, and linguistic inclusivity.
Okay, so as you can see, when we're talking about the pre-colonial world, we're talking about a world that that precedes the imposition of one language, one culture, one identity. So if you look at the areas of the world where the colonial system, especially European colonialism, had the least impact, you'll see that this linguistic, cultural, and ethnic diversity that you find in those particular regions is in fact something that was shared by all of our ancestors. All of our ancestors shared this trans-plurilinguality, trans-pluriculturality, and trans-pluriethnicity. It's only when in certain parts of the world you get the phenomenon of monolithic colonial imposition of one language, one culture, and one identity or ethnicity, that this diversity becomes endangered and in some cases extinguished. So if you look at the three examples that we gave before, you can say that actually what we're talking about are linguistic practices that yes, persist in the Caribbean, that yes, persist in the Niger Delta, that yes, persist in Papua New Guinea, but these are not just isolated to these areas. All of our ancestors had these practices, but with colonization, some of these practices have been endangered or actually erased or repressed. But what happens when what happens after colonialism? What happens after the Europeans invade? Okay, well, in the Caribbean, we talked about a situation where your mother might speak Caribe, your father might speak Caquetillo, you might, when you go to the market, you might speak Island Caribe and Maipure, okay? And you'd have the same kind of situation in West Africa, very multilingual situation, the same kind of situation in South Pacific. What happened? What happens when colonial invasion occurs? Okay, what we're arguing here is that Creole repertoires and varieties promote plurilingual diversity and cosmopolitanism. So we suggest that the speakers of Papiamento in the Caribbean, Aruba, Bonaire, and Curaçao, the speaker of West African Pidgin Creole in places like Gambia, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Ghana, Cameroon, Nigeria, Equatorial Guinea, and speakers of Melanesian Pidgin Creole in places like Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, generally use these Creole repertoires and varieties in such a way as to promote plurilingual conviviality. In other words, to promote the same kind of pluricultural, plurilinguistic, pluriethnic diversity that was shared by all of our ancestors. This is in sharp contrast to the linguistic competition promoted by the use of standardized languages, named languages from the metropoles. Okay, so there's a basic difference between the way people are using these colonial era Creole languages and the way that people use these colonizing standardized languages like English, French, and Spanish. So if you look at what happens after colonization in these three areas of the world, you don't actually get a phenomenon whereby one language takes over. And what you get instead is an expansion of the pre-colonial plurilingualism. So in the Caribbean, in Aruba, Bonaire, and Curaçao, this repertoire, this multilingual repertoire, historical repertoire, gets expanded to include now the Iberian Lexifier Creoles Papiamento, along with Spanish, English, and Dutch. In West Africa, not only are these traditional ancestral languages continuing to be spoken, but also people are now speaking West African Pidgin Creole, and people are speaking English and French. So it's even more linguistic diversity and more linguistic pluralism. And in the South Pacific, the same situation. Not only are these ancestral languages being preserved, but people are also speaking Melanesian Pidgin Creole and English and French. Why is this happening? Why in these areas do you get an expansion in plurilingualism, pluriculturalism, pluriethnicity, whereas in other parts of the world after colonization, you get the imposition of one language, one culture, and one ethnicity. So what makes the difference? Okay, so what we would argue is one of the key factors here is the fact that in Aruba and Borneo and Curaçao, they speak Papiamento, and Papiamento is an Iberian Lexicofire Creole. Its words come from Spanish, but the language practices of Papiamento speakers are more like the language practices of these people, of these that are typified by these ancestral languages, and less like the language practices associated with Spanish, English, and Dutch. So that, in other words, the inclusivity and plurilingualism that was typical of the pre-colonial era is able to be preserved and perpetuated because people are speaking this colonial era Iberian Lexicofire Creole. Similarly, in West Africa, why? How is it that these languages, Kalabari, Kana, Igbo, and Ijo, are still spoken until today, alongside English and French? So English and French are not exterminating those languages, but are actually complementing those languages. What's the secret? What's the difference? Well, in this area of the world, people also speak an English Lexicofire colonial era Creole. And that English Lexicofire colonial era Creole, West African Pidgin Creole, preserves the same inclusive linguistic practices that these ancestral languages had, which means that people can continue in their plurilinguistic and plurilingual, pluricultural, and pluriethnic traditions. Same in the South Pacific. In the South Pacific, people speak Melanesian Pidgin Creole, which is a colonial Creole, and because it has inclusive linguistic practices rather than exclusive linguistic practices like English and French do, it allows for the continued existence of all these pre-colonial ancestral languages, plus it allows for the coexistence of those languages with English and French as colonial languages. Okay, so basically, what we're arguing for is that the linguistic practices of inclusion, usually embodied in the use of these Creole repertoires and varieties, are more similar to the language practices of users of the ancestral repertoires and varieties spoken throughout the pre-colonial era than they are to the exclusionary linguistic practices usually embodied in the use of English, French, Spanish, or Dutch. Okay, so what you have here in Aruba and Borneo and Curaçao is because people speak Papiamento, they can also speak at the same time English, Dutch, and Spanish. They can fluently go from one to the other. Why? Because Papiamento has allowed them to preserve that inclusivity and openness that was typical of their ancestral language practices. Again, because people in West Africa speak West African Pidgin Creole, okay, that is a language that comes with colonialism, but allows their traditional inclusivity and openness, their linguistic inclusivity and openness to persist, to be preserved in the face of the colonial languages, French and English. And in the South Pacific, you have the same phenomenon where because people speak Melanesian Pidgin Creole, that allows them to preserve and perpetuate that those traditional linguistic practices of inclusivity and openness in the face of these colonial languages, of the colonial languages of the region, like French, English, Bahasa Indonesia, etc.
We conclude that in a non-trivial sense, Papiamento, West African Pidgin Creole, and Melanesian Pidgin Creole, and the other colonial era Creoles are not new languages, but instead that the linguistic practices normally adopted by users of these Creole repertoires or varieties date back to the linguistic practices that have typified the plurilingual existence of our species, on this planet for the past 300,000 years.
On the other hand, the linguistic practices of the users of colonizing standardized languages are the product of the new phenomenon of the colonizing use of language to weaponize conquest, to facilitate the internalization of systems of domination, and to operationalize systems of social exclusion. In our future research, we will explore the implications of these insights for debates concerning issues such as the decolonization of linguistic theory and practice, the role of home languages in schools, and the trans-language classrooms.
Okay, so basically we have that presentation plus Francis's presentation. We are now open to your comments and your questions on any aspect of those presentations.
Both presentations are great, and the presentation on African storytelling, for me, it's a good place to start, and then progress towards African influence creoles across the world. Let me think. So I'm leaving the place open. Now that I have the mic, let me read one of my poems I was going to read to show how when Francis talks about the griot role, it's not just storytellers or historians, but poets included, because you might not be recording the historical, the vertical or horizontal history of migration movements like in Sundiata, the creating of empires and so on, but it can be minute little things of one's location that the singer, the musician, the novelist, the storyteller is recording, not just for today, but for posterity, joining the many voices that have been recording those stories. Without story, there is no life. So here is a poem called Epithets on the Unstoried Tombs. A story, also multiple levels of rooms. So it goes, it's a very short poem. Semper denos corazon, Drumi dushi, Big Mama, Rust zacht. Others etch the desires of the left behind, fumes of sudden flesh beneath ground, seethe through new soil monuments. Sail to the surface to escape the rot, seek a nostril for refreshing rebirth. I pack my Ghana must go back, hasten to step away from the silent home, saunter toward tunes of heavy metal broth, my heavy metal dreaming, guide me home in tongues. I step into memory's forest, following the sound, Drumi Dushi, dream walker, Drumi Dushi, dream weaver, dream. So that's my comment on the presentation in Curacao. I'm living among graveyards, and I step out and I hear all these voices, all these smells of the departed, but they are still hanging around. The spirits, the body has not disintegrated completely yet, so they are still speaking to me. I can smell the newly spirits deprived of their bodies. And the Drumi Dushi means dream, sweet dreams in Papiamento, and it's written on the tombstones. So if you go to Williamstead, Curacao, visit the graveyards, there you will actually hear Creole. You will hear multiple languages. You go to the Jewish cemetery, you find a different language there. You go to the public cemetery, you have Africans, unbaptized Christians. Then you go to the Catholic place, and all the languages are written there, some in English, some in Papiamento, some in Dutch, etc., etc. So for me, this was a great presentation you guys did. It just reminded me, sent me back to Curacao, sent me back to Aruba, sent me back. I've not gone to Bonaire yet, but I've been to Nigeria, I've been to Ghana, and I've been to Sierra Leone. So great way to round up with a great presentation. Plurilingue.
Yes, yes. So these things persist. So just like the tradition of griot persists, maybe in a new form digitally, but it persists. It rises up through the soil and takes on all kinds of unpredictable forms, forms that in places you never would have dreamed, in a digital space, a space that is so infected by colonialism. All of a sudden you have griots on that space. And then we think of Creole languages, colonial era Creole languages, as a product of colonialism only. But actually, that erases the agency of colonized peoples. And actually, if you look at the language practices, those inclusive language practices, those open language practices, that is evidence of that agency of colonized peoples, that they have taken those languages and transformed them into languages that look more, in some ways, like their ancestral languages and less like the colonizing languages, especially in some of the most important aspects. That is, languages that are inclusive rather than exclusive. Getting back to griots and storytelling, stories that are not monologues, but dialogues. There's an audience there. So looking at, so other questions or comments? Okay, Francis has put the transcript of one of the performances in the chat, just in case you want to see that. But again, what I saw in Francis's presentation was a persistence of one of the areas of the use of language as literature, but also in other contexts, in all contexts, that is ignored by specialists in literature and specialists in linguistics. It's the dialogical aspect, the fact that you have an audience, that you're never without an audience. Whether it's an audience right in front of your face, a virtual audience, or an imagined audience, there's always an audience. So that dialogical aspect is a key part of what a griot performance, but not just a griot performance. Many of the kinds of performances we've been talking about today, whether it be stick fighting, spiritual performances, etc. So again, that involvement of the audience and the power of that kind, making that kind of connection with an audience, getting back to Isaias's presentation, where he talked about how effective just plain storytelling is in terms of an inclusive practice that brings people in, rather than a rant about LGBTQI rights, which is more exclusive and leaving people out. So these stories invite people in, and before they know it, they are more supportive of LGBTQIA interests and struggles. So that, I think, comes through in the really, really fascinating work that Francis is doing with digital media. So there are many, many aspects of Francis's work that really drive that home. And then in terms of the other presentation, another area that's been systematically ignored by people who specialize in the study of literature and the study of linguistics, the study of language in general, is two other areas. One is variation, in other words, the dialectal aspect of language, that language is by its very nature something that's never the same. No word is ever uttered in the same way twice. So language by its very nature is varied, it's diverse, and in that variation there are all kinds of contradictions. You can't domesticate language to obey a theory. You can't put language in a box. You can't predict language. So that variation escapes that. And then secondly, the dialectical aspect of language, which is that of power relationships. So when Frances is talking about storytelling, she's talking about a type of storytelling that involves an audience as a co-creator of meaning. It's not the storyteller who has a monopoly on meaning and everybody else just passively consumes the meaning of the storyteller. There is the relationship is not a top-down relationship. The relationship is a horizontal one where everybody's working together to create meaning. Storytellers and people who are in the audience. And we can say the same thing about what happens in areas where these colonial era creoles are being spoken. Okay, in other words, those pre-colonial traditions of more symmetrical relations of power, where people work together as agents to create their linguistic, cultural, ethnic, social, political, economic realities. They are being preserved in those Creole languages. Whereas if you go to areas where you don't have a Creole language being spoken, then it's much more likely that when the colonial language comes in, it will just exterminate all the other languages, because the logic of colonialism is conquest, exclusion, and the imposition of one way of thinking, one way of speaking, one way of acting, one language, one culture, one ethnicity, one identity, etc., etc. Okay, I guess it's time to wrap up. So maybe I will give the floor over to Professor Kouabon to wrap up. I'm sorry, in the beginning of this symposium, there were technical difficulties, and Professor Kouabon was not allowed to give his introductory remarks. So maybe he can include some of those in the farewell remarks.
Thank you for everyone who participated, who are listening online. As I put in my initial comment, we really are grateful to the Institute of Caribbean Studies that has supported this program over the years. And we've reached the 20th anniversary. We thought we would not exist after 2020. We thought COVID would infect everyone, but we survived COVID-19 and we're still waxing strong. So thanks to the Institute of Caribbean Studies. Also thanks to Professor Farah Class, whose vision. So he's a griot. He foresaw that this would be a good place to encourage our students and other professors globally to participate and present some of their research as a kind of symposium. And for me, this has really worked very well for us and for the students. Finally, I want to acknowledge the ghosts of the people in Aruba, because the first poem I was going to read was a libation of remembrance. I was going to open the session with a poetic libation that will recognize the transatlantic, the interconnectedness between Africa and the Caribbean and North America. But the spirits did not allow me because I had not prepared well. As a griot has to prepare spiritually, just as professors have to prepare their pedagogies of instruction. and so thanks everyone. These were great presentations. And for me, this year is special. This one was special because of the inclusion of children's issues and trauma issues. It's very dear to my heart that when we talk about trauma, etc., etc. So today, three who did the children's narratives and trauma and natural disaster, I would say keep it up because we need it. And finally, I want to say that I'm learning how to do critical thinking with my children, not that I'm teaching them, they are teaching me how to think critically according to their generation. So every day they post something from the internet digitally, and then Dad, read this, watch this, and we want your opinion on it. If I misfire, they give it to me. But when I say the right thing, they say, yes, you are beginning to understand. You are now beginning to unlearn and relearn. So I think the idea of critical thinking is both ways. The respondents did very well about to it. So the Barbadian story is really touching also, that you don't need a large group of people to start a social movement that becomes global, but you can take one person who is bold enough, who has got the gift of sacrifice, that they will sacrifice their time, their body, their mind in order to get things right, etc., etc. So thanks again, everybody. Thanks for class. Thanks presenters, and may your day be blessed.
Okay, so many thanks, Professor Kuabong, and that wraps up this Symposio Caribe Plurilingue. And I hope we hope to Professor Kuabong and I hope to see you present at the next Caribe Plurilingue, which will happen in sometime around April. So every April, every October, November period, please remember Caribe Plurilingue and come with your submit an abstract and come and tell us about the exciting work that you're doing.
Yeah.
Take good care. Abrazos.
Take good care.
Virtual hugs.
Yes. And for she gone, who wrote the working in Loisa with the children's book?
Gabi.
Gabby.
Yeah,
I would like to have a copy when the book comes out, or unless it's come out already. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, Gabi, you there? Okay, maybe you have to do an exchange. Your book for her book.
Yes, because I can introduce her book to my classes next semester.
Excellent.
Yes. All right.
Bye. Yes. Have a great holiday season. Enjoy. Sing, dance, eat, and enjoy all of the people that you love. So in any case, some of you I'll see tomorrow, but others of you I'll see you hopefully soon. Take good care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Professor. A quick question, Dr. Faraklas.
Okay, let me stop the recording first.